Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe a blanket, maybe a drink, maybe just that tired part of your mind that has been carrying too much all day and needs somewhere quiet to rest. Tonight we're not going to a battlefield, even though there were plenty of wars in the age we're about to enter. We're not going first to a throne room, though the man whose name is attached to this disaster sat on one of the most powerful thrones in the world. We're not beginning with generals, palace officials or marble halls. We're beginning with a sound, the low creak of a ship coming into harbour, the scrape of rope against wood, the voices of dock workers calling to one another in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and languages that never made it into the official histories. A sack of grain is lifted from the hold. A man wipes sweat from his neck. Somewhere beneath the boards, in the dark where no one is looking, something small moves. Not an army, not a rebel, not a barbarian force at the frontier. Just a flea, or a rat, or the invisible life inside them, travelling with the food that kept an empire alive. The Justinianic Plague, the first great plague pandemic recorded in the Old World, began in the 6th century and is generally associated with the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same broad plague-causing organism later linked to the Black Death, though scholars still debate the scale and consequences of the first pandemic with real seriousness. It appears in the written record in 541, reached Constantinople in 542, and returned in waves for generations afterward into the middle of the 8th century. And here is the thing that makes this story so unsettling. The people who lived through it did not know any of that. They did not know the name of the bacterium. They did not know about fleas as carriers in the way modern science would later understand. They did not know that tiny bodies could move through an empire faster than an imperial messenger. They knew ships came in. They knew grain was unloaded. They knew people developed fevers. They knew swellings appeared in the groin, beneath the arms, behind the ears. They knew neighbours who had been speaking one morning were being carried out before the next. And they knew, in the most human way possible, that something had entered their world and had not asked permission. Before we go any further, I want you to notice where you are right now. What time is it where you're listening from? Is the room dark? Is there a little light from a phone screen, a lamp, a hallway, the window? Are you somewhere quiet, or is the world still moving around you? I ask, because tonight's story is, in one sense, about disease, empire, trade, and death. But in another sense, it is about the ordinary human need to feel that tomorrow will resemble today, that the bread will still be sold, that the church doors will still open, that the market will still be noisy, that the person sleeping beside you will wake up in the morning. Every society, no matter how grand it looks from a distance, rests on that small private assumption. And in the years of the Justinianic Plague, that assumption began to fail. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling in and feeling that quiet pull of history, it would mean the world to me if you hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it. When some small detail makes the past seem close enough to touch, and if you want to share where you're listening from tonight, whether it is a bedroom, a couch, a kitchen, or some corner of the world that once belonged to another empire entirely, leave it in the comments. I really do love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let the room soften a little. Let the noise of the present move to the edges, and come with me all the way back to the year 542, to Constantinople, the city that called itself the New Rome. To understand what the plague meant when it arrived, you have to understand what Constantinople was. Not just a city, not just a capital, not just a cluster of walls and churches on a map. Constantinople was a machine for gathering the world into one place. It sat where Europe leaned toward Asia, where the Black Sea opened toward the Mediterranean, where ships could bring grain from Egypt, silk from the east, spices, wine, oil, timber, marble, papyrus, soldiers, officials, monks, merchants, beggars, and rumours. If you stood near the harbour on the right day, you could hear the empire breathing. Carts rolled over stone, sailors shouted prices, porters bent beneath sacks of wheat. Fishmongers worked with wet hands. Priests moved through the streets with practised dignity. Imperial clerks hurried with documents sealed and folded. Children pushed between adults. Dogs nosed at refuse. Somewhere, always, someone was arguing about money. That is one of the most reliable sounds in history. Empires changed their languages, their borders, their gods, their uniforms, but people arguing about money in the market remain almost comfortingly consistent. The city had been made powerful by geography, but it survived by supply. Constantinople could not feed itself from its immediate surroundings. A city that large needed an enormous flow of food, especially grain, and much of that grain came across the sea from Egypt, whose harvest had fed Roman populations for centuries. The same system that made the capital strong also made it vulnerable. Ships were not just ships, they were moving rooms. They carried cargo, men, damp rope, spoiled food, insects, waste and animals that people tolerated because there was no simple way to prevent them. A grain ship was a pantry for rats. A harbour was a meeting place for rats from one region and rats from another. No one watching a sack of wheat come down a gangplank would have thought of it as a possible doorway for catastrophe. They would have thought of it as dinner, wages, tax revenue, army supply, imperial stability. And that is one of the frightening lessons of this pandemic. Disaster did not arrive dressed as disaster. It arrived as normal life doing what normal life had always done. The disease seems to have been reported first around Pelusium, a port city near the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, before spreading toward Alexandria, Palestine, and then across the sea lanes into the wider Mediterranean world. Procopius, the great historian of Justinian's reign, described the plague's progress from Egypt and then into Constantinople, and although his account was shaped by the literary habits and fears of his time, it remains one of the central eyewitness descriptions of the event. That word eyewitness matters. We are not dealing only with a later legend polished by centuries of retelling. We have voices from the age itself, men who saw the city change, who watched streets empty, who tried to describe an event that did not fit comfortably inside ordinary language. Procopius wrote as a historian of wars, buildings, emperors and campaigns, but when he turned to the plague, he found himself describing something that behaved unlike an army. Armies had roads, commanders, supply lines, banners. This seemed to move with a terrible independence. It crossed borders without negotiating. It entered houses without force. It ignored rank more effectively than any moral philosopher ever could. The poor died, the useful died, the obscure died, and then people whispered that even the Emperor Justinian himself had fallen ill and survived. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not as a dramatic fact about a famous ruler, but as a piece of emotional information. In most imperial systems, the emperor was not simply a man with a difficult job, he was the living centre of order. His health mattered symbolically. His body was tied, in the imagination of the people, to the body of the empire. Justinian had spent the years before the plague acting like a man determined to restore the Roman world. He had codified law. He had sent armies westward. He had reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals and pushed into Italy against the Ostrogoths. He had built, or rather rebuilt, one of the most famous churches in human history, Hagia Sophia, after earlier unrest had burned the city's centre. He was not a passive ruler. He was an emperor of projects, plans, taxes, laws, campaigns, construction, theology, and administrative pressure. His reign had motion in it. Then the plague arrived, and motion itself became dangerous. A person going to the market might bring home food or fever. A porter carrying grain might carry infection. A priest visiting the sick might become one of them. A family member doing the loving thing, the necessary thing, the human thing, could become the next person laid down in the house. Here is what makes the first pandemic so difficult to imagine honestly. We know too much and not enough at the same time. We know the modern scientific name of the likely pathogen. Ancient DNA studies have identified Yersinia pestis in human remains associated with the first pandemic, giving biological support to what older historians once had to infer mainly from descriptions of symptoms and spread. But we do not know exactly what every neighbourhood experienced. We do not know the true number of deaths in Constantinople. Procopius gives terrifying figures, including a claim that deaths reached thousands per day at the height of the outbreak. But modern historians treat such numbers with caution, because ancient authors often used large figures to communicate scale and horror, rather than precise statistical measurement. We do not know the name of the first woman in the capital who noticed a swelling and tried to hide it from her family. We do not know the first child who asked why the neighbour's door had not opened that morning. We do not know how many people recovered and then spent the rest of their lives wondering why they had been spared. History gives us emperors and chroniclers. The plague gave grief to people whose names were never written down. Let us step into one of those ordinary streets, not the grand ceremonial avenue, not the court, not the places where mosaics glittered and officials processed in silk. A narrower street, a place where the stones are uneven, where upper stories lean toward one another, where laundry hangs, where cooking smells drift from doorways, where the air carries smoke, animals, sweat, and the sour odour of crowded life. Constantinople was magnificent, but magnificence did not make it clean. No ancient or early medieval city of great size could keep itself truly clean by modern standards. Waste moved slowly. Water systems could be impressive and still insufficient. Crowding made privacy rare. People lived close to their neighbours, close to animals, close to food stores, close to the refuse of daily survival. When we imagine pandemic life, we often picture isolation first, each household sealed into its own fear. But in a city like Constantinople, life was interdependent in ways that made clean separation nearly impossible. You needed bread, you needed water, you needed someone to carry messages, you needed priests, midwives, servants, customers, employers, creditors, debtors, relatives. You could try to withdraw from the city, but the city had already entered your life through every necessity you depended on. The first signs may not have looked dramatic enough. That is part of the cruelty of many diseases. They begin almost politely, a fever, a heaviness in the body. Person who says they are tired, who sits down earlier than usual, who does not finish the food in front of them. Procopius described fever as an early symptom, sometimes not alarming at first, and then the appearance of buboes, those swollen and painful lumps associated with bubonic plague, in places where the body keeps its hidden tenderness, the groin, the armpit, behind the ear. Imagine trying to understand that in a world without germ theory. The body has become a message, but no one can read it correctly. Physicians argue, priests pray, families try remedies. Some people sleep and do not wake. Some fall into delirium. Some survive, and survival itself becomes confusing. Why that man and not his brother? Why that woman and not the child she nursed? Why one house emptied and the next house spared for a week, until it too is not spared? The human mind hates randomness. It will accept punishment before it accepts meaninglessness. So people searched for causes in sin, stars, bad air, divine anger, corruption, fate, foreignness, and whatever explanation allowed the world to feel governed by something more understandable than chance. This is where we need to be careful. It is easy to look back and feel superior because we know about bacteria and they did not. But people in the 6th century were not stupid. They were observant. They saw patterns. They noticed that illness moved. They knew that contact with sickness could be dangerous, even if they could not explain the mechanism in modern terms. They had medical traditions, hospitals in some places, trained physicians, herbal treatments, religious healing practices, and long experience with fever, famine, and epidemic disease. What they lacked was the particular map that would have shown them the invisible route from animal reservoir to flea to rat to human body, and from pneumonic cases possibly onward through breath. Without that map, the world became frighteningly suggestive. A smell might be blamed, a wind, a stranger, a cargo, a punishment. The same ship that brought grain also brought suspicion. The same neighbour who came to help might later be remembered as the one who stood too close. And while all this was happening, the machinery of empire did not simply stop. That may be the most exhausting part to imagine. Taxes still existed, laws still existed, soldiers still needed pay, grain still needed distribution. The emperor's government still had to function, even while the city that housed it was choking on fear and loss. Justinian's reign depended on administration, and administration depends on people who can stand at desks, count, seal, carry, record, demand, and enforce. What happens when the clerks are sick? What happens when the men who move goods through the harbour are dead or afraid? What happens when inheritance disputes multiply because entire households are suddenly broken? What happens when land still owes tax, but the hands that worked it are buried, missing, or too weak to rise? These sound like cold questions, but they are not cold to the people living under them. They are the questions that decide whether bread reaches a table, whether a widow keeps a roof, whether a field is planted, whether an army eats, whether the city remains a city. Modern scholarship has become more cautious about saying that the Justinianic Plague single-handedly ended antiquity or shattered the empire beyond repair. Some scholars argue that older accounts exaggerated the pandemic's demographic and political effects, while others continue to emphasize its serious regional impact and the way recurrent plague waves interacted with war, climate stress, taxation, and economic strain. That debate matters, and we're going to respect it. This story is not helped by turning the plague into a simple villain that explains everything that happened afterward. History almost never works that neatly. Empires do not fall because of one cause, just as families do not suffer in only one way. The 6th century world was already under pressure from war, political ambition, environmental shocks, local shortages, and the constant expense of governing a vast and difficult realm. The plague entered that world not as the only problem, but as a problem that touched every other problem. It made labour scarcer where people died. It made fear heavier where rumours spread. It made religious questions sharper. It made imperial confidence look less solid. It turned private rooms into places of decision. Should we flee? Should we stay? Should we care for the sick? Should we open the door? Should we confess? Should we hide the body until someone comes? What if no one comes? That last question may be the one that brings us closest to the lived reality of plague. What if no one comes? In normal times, death has procedures. Even hard deaths, even poor deaths, usually have someone who knows what is supposed to happen next. The body is washed, the family gathers, the prayers are said, the grave is opened. The community acknowledges that a person has moved from the world of the living into memory. Pandemic death attacks those procedures. It makes death too numerous, too fast, too frightening. It can turn care into risk and mourning into logistics. Procopius wrote of bodies' overwhelming burial practices in Constantinople, of the normal order failing under the pressure of too many dead, though again we have to read his horror as both testimony and literary construction. Still, even if we reduce the numbers, even if we correct for exaggeration, the human reality remains. There were days when people in that city saw more death than their customs could absorb. And when custom fails, people feel as if the world itself has become unsafe. I keep thinking about a household at dusk. Not an emperor's household, not a bishop's residence, just a family somewhere in the city or perhaps in a town connected to the same routes of trade and news. The evening meal is smaller than usual because someone has not gone out to buy what was needed. The father keeps listening to footsteps outside. The mother has noticed that one of the children is too warm. An older relative says it may be nothing. Everyone wants it to be nothing, so for a little while they agree that it's nothing. The lamp burns. The street outside grows quieter earlier than it used to. Somewhere nearby a door opens and closes. Someone coughs. Someone prays aloud. Not because it is time for prayer, but because fear has made prayer necessary in the middle of ordinary speech. The child sleeps badly. By morning the swelling has appeared. Now the family knows, or thinks it knows, and every person in the room becomes aware of their own body. Is my head warm? Is that pain ordinary? Did I touch the cup? Did I sleep too close? Love does not vanish in such moments, but it becomes frightened of itself. This is why we're going slowly. It would be easy to tell the Justinianic Plague as a series of large statements. A pandemic began. It spread. It killed. It affected an empire. It returned. Those statements are true, but they are not enough. They make the event sound clean, almost manageable. Real pandemic life is not clean. It is waiting. It is listening. It is counting how long someone has been feverish. It is deciding whether to spend money now or save it for burial. It is arguing quietly because loud argument might disturb the sick. It is the smell of vinegar, smoke, sweat, old bedding, and fear. It is a city where the market still opens but no longer feels like a market. It is a church where people come for comfort and find other frightened bodies standing close together. It is an official order written in formal language while the man copying it wonders whether he will live to see it carried out. It is the knowledge that the empire is still called eternal by people who have begun to understand how quickly a body can fail. So tonight, as we begin this journey into the first plague pandemic, keep two images beside each other. On one side, the empire of Justinian, laws, armies, gold, marble, ships, theology, ambition. The great dome of Hagia Sophia rising over the city like a statement that order could be built from stone. On the other side, the small hidden world beneath the floorboards of a grain ship, where the empire's own routes of supply may have carried something no law could command and no wall could stop. Between those two images is the story we are about to follow. Not just the story of a disease, but the story of people trying to remain human while their explanations failed them. The sailors who brought the grain, the dock workers who unloaded it, the families who bought bread, the physicians who examined swellings they could not cure, the priest who walked toward houses other people avoided, the gravediggers who kept working until work itself became impossible, the emperor who survived, the countless unnamed who did not. And before we enter the houses, before we stand in the streets of Constantinople at the height of the dying, before we ask what happened to faith, food, labour, burial, and memory, we need to follow the path by which the sickness entered Justinian's world, because the plague did not appear everywhere at once. It travelled through the same networks that made life possible, and that is what made it so difficult to escape. The harbour is where the story begins to move, not in the emperor's palace, not beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, not in the halls where lawyers and bishops argued over words that could decide the fate of souls. It begins beside water, with men whose names no one preserved, men with rope burns on their palms and salt in the hems of their tunics, men who knew the weight of a grain sack better than they knew the policies of Justinian's court. It begins with ships coming in because ships were the veins of Justinian's world. They carried wheat, oil, wine, soldiers, tax revenue, letters, officials, holy men, merchants, slaves, stories, rumours, and sometimes, without anyone knowing it, death. A ship entering harbour did not look frightening. It looked like relief. It meant the city would eat. It meant contracts would be honoured. It meant bakers could work and soldiers could be fed and officials could continue pretending that the empire was a thing of marble and law rather than a thing of food, weather, animals and human backs. The first pandemic seems to have entered the written record around Pelusium, a port near the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, and Procopius describes the disease as moving from there toward Alexandria and the rest of Egypt in one direction, and toward Palestine in another, before spreading farther through the known world. Picture Pelusium for a moment, not as a name in a chronicle, but as a working place. It stood near one of the most important approaches to Egypt, where land routes and waterways met, where officials cared about grain because grain was never just food. In an empire, grain is obedience made edible. People may tolerate taxes, sermons, soldiers, bad governors, and distant rulers longer than we expect, but hungry cities become dangerous very quickly. The Roman state had understood that for centuries. Feed the capital, and the capital remains governable. Fail to feed it, and every street corner becomes a place where politics can begin. By Justinian's time, Constantinople depended heavily on imported grain, especially from Egypt, and the flow of that grain connected the fields of the Nile to the mouths of families in the imperial capital. The arrangement was practical, old, and impressive. It was also exactly the kind of arrangement a disease could use. This is one of those moments when modern knowledge can make the past feel almost cruel. We can look at a grain ship and imagine rats in the hold. We can imagine fleas moving through fur. We can imagine Yersinia pestis multiplying inside a flea's gut, blocking it, making it feed again and again, passing bacteria into a new host. We can imagine the chain, not perfectly in every case, not with every local detail solved, but clearly enough to understand the danger. The people standing on the dock did not have that picture. They saw cargo, they saw work, they saw money, they saw food for a city that could not simply decide to live without it. Researchers have now found ancient DNA evidence connecting the first plague pandemic to Yersinia pestis, and genomic work has shown that the strains associated with the Justinianic pandemic formed a distinct branch from later plague lineages, meaning the 6th century pandemic was not simply the Black Death arriving early, but one of the repeated ways plague emerged from animal reservoirs into human history. Think about the inside of that ship. The hold is dark, warm in some places, damp in others. Grain dust floats in the air and settles on skin, hair, rope, wood and cloth. Men sleep badly, close to one another, close to cargo, close to whatever else has found shelter aboard. Rats are not dramatic creatures when they are part of ordinary life. They are background movement. A scratch behind the boards, a flash near a sack. A problem, yes, but not a prophecy. A sailor might curse them, stamp his foot, throw something, and then go back to work. He does not imagine that one of them could matter more than the orders of an emperor. He does not imagine that the smallest life on board may have more power over the empire than the captain, the tax official, or the armed guard watching the cargo. It is tempting to say the plague travelled by ship as if the ship itself made the decision. But what really carried the disease was a whole world of need. Egypt needed to export. Constantinople needed to import. Sailors needed wages. Officials needed accounts balanced. Bakers needed flour. Families needed bread. The sick did not travel through an empty system. They travelled through a system everyone depended on. That is what made it so hard to interrupt. If a stranger arrived at a city gate bleeding and shouting warnings, people might close the gate. But if the warning was hidden inside the normal delivery of grain, inside the ordinary creak of a ship that had come every season before, there was no moment when anyone clearly knew to say stop. From Pelusium, the disease moved through routes that already existed. Procopius says it divided going toward Alexandria and the rest of Egypt, and also toward Palestine, and from there onward. That detail matters because it reminds us that the plague did not need a single road. It could follow many. Alexandria was not just any city. It was a great Mediterranean port, an old intellectual and commercial centre, a place where ships, sailors, merchants, officials and supplies met constantly. Palestine connected Egypt with Syria and the wider eastern Mediterranean. Roads and sea lanes formed a net, and the plague moved through the knots. A merchant leaves one port before anyone understands what is happening. A ship takes on cargo in another. A clerk records an arrival. A soldier complains of fever. A man sleeps in a lodging house near the harbour and does not rise. A servant carries bedding out into the sun. A family member touches what love requires them to touch. By the time fear has a name, movement has already done its work. We should be careful not to imagine a neat map with a red line crawling steadily from place to place, like something in a classroom animation. Real spread is messier. Some places are struck hard, others lightly. Some hear rumours weeks before the first known death. Some may see illness and fail to connect it to the larger event. A port town may become frightened before an inland village knows anything. A monastery may record disaster with theological urgency, while another settlement leaves no written trace at all. The first pandemic lasted not as one single continuous wave everywhere, but as a series of outbreaks that returned in different regions over roughly 2 centuries, from the first outbreak in the 540s until around the mid-8th century, though historians still debate the scale and interpretation of its effects. That means the beginning we are following was not only an event, it was the opening of a long pattern. Now let us follow one shipment, not because we know the name of the ship, because we do not, and not because history has preserved the exact faces aboard, because it has not. Let us follow it because this is how a pandemic becomes intimate. The ship leaves Egypt heavy with grain. Perhaps some of the men aboard have already heard of sickness inland. Perhaps they have heard nothing. The weather matters. The condition of the cargo matters. The time spent in harbour matters. The animals aboard matter. The men complain about ordinary things: pay, food, bad water, a captain's temper, the smell below deck, the uncertainty of arrival. If one sailor develops fever, it may not yet seem like the end of anything. Fever is common in the ancient world. People get fevers all the time. A man who works near water, sleeps badly, eats poorly, and strains his body can become ill for many reasons. Someone tells him to lie down. Someone else tells him to stop being useless. The ship continues. When the coast of Constantinople comes into view, the city would appear not as a victim waiting to be wounded, but as a triumph. Walls rising, harbours busy, churches visible, a capital that had survived riots, fires, political tension, and war. A place that had been rebuilt after the Nika revolt in 532, when massive unrest devastated parts of the city, and Justinian responded not by shrinking his ambitions, but by building more grandly than before. Hagia Sophia itself, completed in the years before the plague, stood as one of the greatest architectural statements of the age. The timing feels almost too sharp. A city raises a dome that seems to declare heaven and empire joined in stone, and within a few years a disease enters through the practical, crowded, dirty places that no mosaic could beautify. Justinian's reign was full of restoration projects, legal reforms, military campaigns, and attempts to reassert Roman power around the Mediterranean, so the plague arrived in a world already in motion. At the harbour, work begins quickly. Grain cannot simply sit in the hold while men compose philosophical reflections about mortality. It has to be moved. Sacks are hauled, counted, checked, taxed, stored, guarded. Porters bend under loads. Supervisors shout. Animals move through the confusion. Rats, disturbed by unloading, seek new shelter. Some remain near the docks. Some move into warehouses. Some find food stores. Some die, which in a plague ecology can be even more dangerous than their ordinary living presence. Because hungry fleas leaving dead hosts may seek new ones. No dock worker sees the chain. What he sees is a bad smell, a dead rat perhaps, something to kick aside or ignore, because the day is long and the work is paid by completion, not by contemplation. He goes home with grain dust on his clothing. He carries his wages. He carries hunger. He may carry something else. The first cases in Constantinople appeared in 542, after the disease had already been reported in the empire's outer regions, and ancient accounts make clear that once it reached the capital, it became a crisis remembered for its intensity. But no city experiences the first cases as history. It experiences them as isolated misfortunes. A man near the harbour is ill. A woman in a crowded quarter has swelling. A child develops fever. A servant collapses. Someone says the air near the docks is bad. Someone blames spoiled grain. Someone else says it came from Egypt. Another says it is punishment. Another says it is the same sickness that was heard of in Palestine. The truth moves more slowly than rumour, and rumour moves more quickly than any official order. By the time people begin comparing stories, the disease has already found houses, bedding, clothing, fleas, bodies, breath, fear, and all the little contacts by which a city is made. There is a strange tenderness in thinking about the people who still try to keep life ordinary during those first days. The baker still opens. The woman still goes out for food because her household needs it. The water carrier still makes his route. A clerk still reports to his office because absence has consequences. Priests still hold services. Merchants still argue. Children still ask for things. Someone still falls in love. Someone still steals. Someone still worries over rent. Even at the beginning of disaster, human life resists becoming only disaster. It keeps its errands. That resistance is not foolish. It is how people survive most days. The difficulty is that during a pandemic, ordinary courage and ordinary necessity can look almost the same from the outside. The man who goes to the market may be reckless, or he may simply have no stored food. The woman who enters a sick room may be ignoring danger, or she may be the only person who will bring water to her mother. Constantinople was especially vulnerable because it was not only large, but connected. A small village can suffer terribly, but its connections are fewer. A capital is a gathering place by design. People enter it for law, trade, worship, employment, petitions, military service, imperial business, and survival. The very things that make it important also make it porous. You cannot have a city that receives the world and then be surprised when it receives the world's diseases. The plague did not need to defeat Constantinople's walls. The walls were meant for armies. They could slow soldiers, cavalry, siege engines, and ambitious enemies. They could not stop a flea in a sack of grain, or a rat in a warehouse, or an infected person who had no visible symptoms when he passed through the gate. The empire's defences were built against the kinds of threats rulers understood best. The plague came through the category of things no one had organised power to see. This is not to say that people were helpless in every way. They could avoid the sick when they realised sickness was present. They could flee if they had somewhere to go and the means to leave. They could isolate themselves in limited ways. Procopius and later commentators describe people withdrawing from contact, and modern writers sometimes call this a kind of self-isolation, though it was not organised public health in the modern sense. But every choice had a cost. To flee meant abandoning work, property, neighbours, obligations, and perhaps family members who could not travel. To stay meant exposure. To close the door meant hunger if supplies ran out. To open the door meant risk. A wealthy household might manage space, servants, storage, and withdrawal better than a poor one. A dockworker's family did not have the luxury of turning the city into an idea and escaping from it. They lived where work was. They lived where danger had entered. One of the most unsettling parts of this story is that the ships were innocent. That may sound like an odd thing to say, but it matters. The ships were not invaders. The grain was not malicious. The sailors were not agents of doom. The trade routes had done what people built them to do, connect places. For centuries, connection had been a sign of civilization and power. Roads, ports, warehouses, coinage, contracts, common law, imperial authority, regular shipments, predictable supply. These were achievements. They made life less local, less fragile in some ways, richer for some, more controllable for the state. But connection always has a double edge. A road that carries soldiers can carry refugees. A harbour that receives grain can receive rats. A trade network that stabilises an empire can transmit instability with remarkable efficiency. The plague did not exploit a weakness separate from imperial strength. It exploited strength itself. There is a lesson in that, though it is not a neat one. People often imagine danger as something outside the system. A barbarian beyond the border, a storm beyond the horizon, a rebel outside the walls. But some dangers travel through the trusted parts of life, through food, through care, through trade, through touch, through the morning routine. That was true in the 6th century in a way the people of Justinian's world could feel before they could explain. A mother did not need germ theory to know that a house became frightening after fever entered it. A dock worker did not need bacteriology to know that something had changed near the harbour. A priest did not need a microscope to know that visiting the sick required courage. Explanation came later. Fear arrived on time. As the ships kept coming, the city's relationship with the sea changed. The sea had always been a promise and a threat. It brought fish and trade, but also storms, pirates, enemies, taxes, strangers, and news no one wanted. During plague, the sea became more ambiguous still. A sail on the horizon might mean food, or it might mean another rumour confirmed. Harbour noise, once a sign of life, could begin to sound like exposure. Men who depended on ships might watch them with resentment and need tangled together. That is one of the hardest emotional states to live inside, needing the thing you fear. Constantinople could not simply reject the grain ships without risking hunger. Yet every arrival may have deepened the sense that the world outside the city was pressing in too closely. The same pattern repeated across the Mediterranean, though never in exactly the same way. Ports were struck because ports are meetings. Inland routes carried the disease farther, because roads extend the work of ships onto land. Armies, merchants, pilgrims, officials, and displaced people all belong to the movement of the age. The Eastern Roman Empire was not an isolated block of territory. It was a living system of exchanges, and plague made those exchanges visible in the worst possible way. What had previously seemed like separate places, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Constantinople, North Africa, Italy, the Balkans, could suddenly be understood as connected by illness as well as by rule and commerce. The first pandemic reminds us that a world does not need modern airplanes to be interconnected. It only needs enough people, animals, ships, roads, and necessity. Some historians have argued strongly for catastrophic mortality and broad transformation, while other recent scholarship has warned that the evidence does not support the most sweeping claims that the Justinianic Plague by itself ended antiquity, or caused massive uniform collapse across the Mediterranean. For our purposes, that caution does not make the story smaller, it makes it more human. We do not need every old number to be exact for the dockside fear to be real. We do not need the pandemic to explain the entire Middle Ages in order to understand what it meant for a city household to lose 3 people in a week. Sometimes, history becomes distorted because we ask one event to explain too much. The plague entered a world already shaped by war, taxation, climate stress, hunger, ambition, and religious tension. It did not have to do everything to matter. It only had to enter enough bodies, enough homes, enough routines, enough ports, and enough memories. Now return to the harbour near evening. The workday is thinning. The last loads are being moved. The water reflects a fading light. Men who have spent the day unloading grain wash their arms if they can, eat if they have food, and begin the walk home. One of them feels a heaviness behind his eyes. Another has noticed a swelling but says nothing, because a man who cannot work may not be paid. A rat lies dead near a warehouse wall. A boy throws a stone at another and misses. A clerk closes a tablet. Somewhere, a woman is kneading dough made from grain that came across the water. She does not know that the same system that brought flour into her hands has also brought fear to her door. She only knows that the dough must rise, the fire must be managed, the household must eat, and the world, despite rumours, must continue for at least one more evening. That is how plague enters a world most effectively. Not as a trumpet blast, not as a black cloud with a name written across it. It enters while people are doing necessary things. It enters through the roots of survival. It enters through men lifting sacks, women buying bread, ships making harbour, officials checking accounts, animals searching for food, and families trusting that the systems that fed them yesterday will feed them tomorrow. By the time Constantinople understood that something terrible had arrived, the city had already welcomed it in the only way a city can welcome anything, by making room for movement. And once the sickness passed from the waterfront into the crowded streets, from the warehouses into the neighbourhoods, from rumour into the human body, the imperial capital became more than a destination. It became a place where the first great pandemic showed what it could do when it found a city too large, too busy, and too dependent on the outside world to close itself completely. By the time the sickness had passed the harbour and entered Constantinople itself, the city was already doing what great cities do best and worst. It was gathering people together. That is the first thing to understand. Constantinople was not a quiet place, waiting passively for disaster. It was loud, crowded, organised, dirty, ambitious, hungry, religious, political, and alive in almost every direction at once. It was the imperial capital of Justinian's Eastern Roman world, a city of harbours and markets, churches and workshops, official buildings and cramped dwellings, marble ceremonies and ordinary rooms where people slept too close to one another, because space inside the walls was valuable. Some modern estimates place the city's 6th century population in the hundreds of thousands, with some scholars allowing for roughly 500,000 people before the plague, though exact numbers are impossible to recover with confidence. What matters for the human story is not the precise figure, but the density. There were too many bodies, too many errands, too many doorways, too many hands passing food and coins and tools and children from one part of the day to the next. A disease did not need to search long for a host in a city like that. It only had to arrive and wait for normal life to continue. Imagine coming into Constantinople before the fear had fully taken hold. The first impression would not have been disease. It would have been scale. The walls enormous and famous, the water shining around the city, the ships at anchor, the smell of pitch, fish, smoke, damp rope, animals, sweat, grain, oil, and human waste, all mixed into that unmistakable odour of a large pre-modern city. There would be churches with lamps burning before icons, public squares where men argued over prices and theology with similar intensity, bakeries producing bread that kept whole neighbourhoods from hunger, workshops where metal rang against metal, and streets so busy that walking through them meant constantly adjusting your body around other people's needs. A woman carrying water, a servant balancing a basket, a monk moving with his head lowered, a child chasing another child between adults, a soldier impatient to pass, a merchant trying not to be cheated, a beggar watching every hand for generosity. A city like this did not offer much distance. Distance was for the countryside, for open roads, for wealthy estates, for people with enough money to choose separation. Inside Constantinople, life pressed close. That closeness shaped everything about the plague once it entered the city. We have to be careful not to imagine apartment buildings and streets in modern terms, but the basic problem is familiar enough. People shared walls, courtyards, wells, ovens, markets, churches and streets. A household might be more private than a market stall, but it was not sealed from the world. Food had to be bought, water had to be fetched, work had to be done, messages had to be carried, religious obligations had to be observed. Even fear had errands. Someone had to go out and ask what was happening. Someone had to find a physician. Someone had to look for a priest. Someone had to purchase oil, bread, wine, linen, vinegar, or whatever remedy the family believed might help. In a modern epidemic, people speak of staying home as if home is a complete unit. For many in Constantinople, home was not complete. It depended on the street. The street depended on the market. The market depended on the harbour. The harbour depended on ships. And the ships, as we have already seen, had brought more than grain. Procopius, who was present in Constantinople when the plague struck, described the disease as beginning with fever and then often producing buboes, the painful swellings that could appear in the groin, under the arms, near the ears, or other parts of the body. His account is one of the most important eyewitness descriptions of the outbreak, even though historians read it with care because he wrote in a literary tradition shaped by earlier plague narratives, especially Thucydides' famous account of plague in Athens. But even allowing for literary shaping, the picture he gives is terrifyingly physical. The plague was not an idea. It was not a rumour once it entered a house. It was heat in the skin. It was swelling. It was delirium. It was sleep that did not refresh. It was a person who had been standing yesterday now lying with eyes unfocused, for while the rest of the household tried to decide whether to move closer or farther away. And in a crowded city, that question was not philosophical. It was immediate. Who brings the water? Who changes the bedding? Who touches the body? Who sleeps in the same room tonight? The city under plague did not become silent all at once. That is too simple. At first, there would have been argument. There always is. Some would say the illness was exaggerated. Some would say it was far away. Some would say it affected only certain quarters, certain kinds of people, certain households, certain sinners, certain foreigners, certain workers near the docks. People like to build little fences in the mind before they have the power to build real ones. It helps them breathe. A merchant might tell himself that dock workers were vulnerable because of the harbour air. A wealthy woman might decide that her household was safer because it was cleaner, better supplied, more protected. A priest might insist that repentance mattered more than flight. A physician might offer an explanation in terms of humours, air, corruption, imbalance, heat, moisture, or some combination that made sense inside the medical learning of the time. A mother might listen to all of them and then put her hand on her child's forehead and know that explanations were not enough. What would it mean to hide in Constantinople? That is the question at the centre of this part of the story. Hiding sounds possible until you imagine it in detail. A wealthy family might retreat into a larger house, restrict visitors, send servants instead of going out themselves, store more food, and pray behind closed doors. Even then the servants came and went. Supplies entered, laundry moved, waste left, news seeped in. A poor family could do far less. If the father worked at the harbour, the market, a workshop, a stable, or in service to another household, staying home might mean losing wages immediately. If the mother bought bread daily because there was no large store of grain in the room, then fear did not remove hunger. Children could be told not to wander, but children are children, and cramped homes send people outward. To hide completely required resources most people did not have. The plague exposed inequality not by inventing it, but by making it harder to ignore. The wealthy could purchase a little distance. The poor often had to keep touching the city, and the city kept touching them back. Coins passed from hand to hand, bread was weighed and handed over, oil jars were sealed and opened, men leaned close to bargain because markets are noisy. People stood together in church because fear drives the frightened towards sacred places, especially in a world where divine meaning was not an optional layer placed over events, but part of reality itself. In 6th century Constantinople, Christianity was not a private weekend habit. It was woven into public time, imperial legitimacy, law, identity, ritual, and fear. When plague came, many people would not have asked only how it spread. They would have asked why God allowed it, what sin it revealed, what repentance it demanded, what holy protection might be sought. Processions, prayers, church attendance, confession, and contact with clergy could comfort the soul, while also bringing bodies together. That is one of the hard truths of religious life during epidemic disease. The same ritual that steadies the heart can place people in the path of one another's breath. The symptoms made the fear more intimate. A wound can be seen from the outside. A fever begins privately. You feel it before anyone else does. You might deny it. You might tell yourself you are tired, that the room is warm, that yesterday's work strained you, that the ache in your groin is nothing, that the swelling will pass. A person in plague-struck Constantinople could spend hours or perhaps a day trapped between knowledge and denial. That in-between time must have been awful. To admit illness was to frighten the house. To conceal it was to risk them. A young man might keep working because his family needed his pay. A servant might hide symptoms because sickness could mean abandonment. A mother might ignore her own fever because a child was already ill, and someone had to remain useful. The plague did not only attack bodies, it attacked honesty, timing, duty and trust. Procopius described how, at the height of the outbreak, death became so common that ordinary burial practices collapsed under the pressure, and he claimed that thousands died each day, a number modern historians treat cautiously even while accepting that the mortality was severe in the capital. Try not to rush past what that means. A city has habits for death. Someone dies, the household responds, neighbours know what to do, religious rites are performed, the dead are taken away, grief has a shape. A terrible thing happens, but society gives it steps. During plague, the steps break. There are too many bodies, too few healthy people, too much fear of touching the dead, too little space. The living begin to encounter death outside its proper place. Not only in beds, not only in cemeteries, not only in churches, but in streets, doorways, carts, and stories. The sight of the dead becomes part of the city's weather. You wake and ask not whether someone has died, but how many, how near, and whether anyone is coming to carry them away. The smell must have been one of the most unforgettable parts. Ancient writers often mention smell when normal burial fails, because smell is the body's way of making distance impossible. You can close your eyes, you can turn your head. You cannot easily refuse the air. In a crowded city during warm months, with too many dead and too few functioning routines, the odour of mortality would have moved through streets and courtyards with a terrible democracy. Rich and poor could not fully escape it, though the rich could close thicker doors. Procopius writes of bodies being piled and burial becoming desperate, and whether every detail is exact or heightened for effect, the basic situation is clear enough. Constantinople's ordinary systems could not absorb the number of deaths quickly enough. Once that happens, the city changes in the mind of its inhabitants. The street is no longer merely the path to the market. The neighbour's door is no longer merely a neighbour's door. A cart is no longer only a cart. Everything begins to suggest illness. Still, not everyone died. This is important. Pandemic narratives often make survival feel like an afterthought, but most human experience happens among those who continue. Some people recovered, some never became visibly ill, some lost everyone around them and remained. Others were ill and survived with the memory of the buboes, the fever, the faces leaning over them, the prayers spoken as if they were already halfway into the next world. Evagrius Scholasticus, a later church historian who experienced plague as a child in Antioch, survived the disease but later wrote of losing many family members and members of his household during subsequent returns of the pandemic. That detail matters because the first pandemic was not only one horrifying season in Constantinople, it returned. It made survival temporary. It taught people that recovery from one wave did not mean the world was safe. Imagine being a child who survives and then grows up with the knowledge that the sickness can come back. Imagine marrying, having children, building a household, and hearing years later that plague has appeared again somewhere along the routes of trade and travel. The past is no longer past when it can re-enter by ship. Inside Constantinople, ordinary work began to bend. Bakers needed flour, fuel and workers. Markets needed sellers and buyers. Physicians needed strength to visit the sick. Priests needed courage to enter houses. Officials needed clerks. The imperial administration needed records, taxes, legal decisions, and orders to continue, because governments are not made of buildings. They are made of people repeating tasks. If enough of those people fall ill, the building may still stand while the government inside it slows, stumbles, and improvises. Justinian's government was known for law and administrative ambition, but plague creates cases no law code can prevent. Who inherits when several relatives die in quick succession? Who pays taxes on land whose workers are gone? Who owns goods when an entire household disappears? What happens when debts outlive the people who made them? These are not side issues. They are the practical aftershocks of mass death. Every body buried leaves behind objects, obligations, rooms, animals, tools, fields, and unanswered claims. And then there is food. Always food. In a city, fear becomes sharper when bread becomes uncertain. If workers are sick, grain transport slows. If farmers outside the city die or flee, supplies suffer. If the harbour is feared, unloading becomes more difficult. If prices rise, the poor feel it first. Reports and later discussions of the plague often connect it with disruption of agriculture, trade, and tax revenue, though the degree and uniformity of that disruption remain debated by modern scholars. For a household, the debate would have taken the form of a simpler question. What does bread cost today? If the answer changed too quickly, fear gained another voice. Disease kills in one way, shortage threatens in another. A family that has escaped fever may still find itself standing in a market with too little money for enough food. That kind of fear is quieter than the sight of buboes, but it sits in the stomach all day. There must have been people who tried to leave. Some always do. Flight is one of the oldest responses to epidemic disease. It is also one of the most complicated. Where do you go from a capital like Constantinople? Out through gates, along roads, into suburbs, villages, estates, monasteries, or relatives' homes if you have them. But leaving is not simple when the disease may already be in your body. A person can carry fear outward. A family can flee the city and bring the sickness to a place that had not yet seen it. People in the countryside may begin to fear city dwellers. Hospitality becomes dangerous. Strangers become suspect. Even relatives may be received with hesitation. This is one of the quiet social damages of plague. It makes kindness hesitate at the threshold. Those who stayed had to develop ways of reading the city. Which street had many deaths? Which church was crowded? Which baker still opened? Which physician was still alive? Which neighbourhood had begun carrying out bodies at night? Which official was enforcing orders? Which families had closed their doors? Which rumours were foolish, and which ones might save your life? The ability to interpret rumour became a survival skill, even though rumour is never fully trustworthy. A woman buying bread might listen more carefully than she spoke. A servant sent on an errand might return not only with oil or flour, but with news. A child might overhear adults and misunderstand just enough to become terrified. Information travelled through markets, churches, wells, doorways, and the mouths of people trying to sound certain. Under plague, a city becomes a listening device. The medical world of Constantinople had learning behind it. Byzantine medicine inherited Greek and Roman traditions, and physicians knew far more than we sometimes imagine when we lazily dismiss pre-modern medicine as ignorance. They could observe symptoms, classify fevers, prescribe regimens, lance swellings in some contexts, use herbs, diet, bathing, and bloodletting according to theories that had internal logic. But plague exposed the limits of that learning. A physician might recognize patterns and still fail to stop the dying. That is a brutal position for anyone whose social role depends on knowledge. The patient looks at you. The family looks at you. The city looks at men like you and asks for help. You have words, techniques, experience, confidence perhaps, and then the body dies anyway. Some physicians likely became ill themselves, some may have fled, some may have kept going out of duty, reputation, faith, money or habit. In an epidemic, medical courage does not always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like a tired man entering another dark room because he has been asked to come. The clergy faced a similar burden. The sick needed prayer. The dying needed rites. Families needed explanation. The city needed public religious response. In a world where disease could be understood as divine chastisement, spiritual leadership mattered intensely. But the priest who came close to the dying also came close to danger. The monk who comforted the sick might become sick. The person who carried holy objects or spoke prayers might be asked to enter places others avoided. Faith did not remove fear. It gave fear a language and a set of actions. Some people may have found deep comfort in that. Others may have wondered why repentance did not stop the fever. Both reactions can exist in the same city, even in the same person. A man can pray sincerely in the morning and feel abandoned by evening. There is a scene I keep returning to because it captures the city better than any number. A narrow room, high in a crowded building or tucked behind a shop. The family has tried to keep the door closed. Outside, the street is not as loud as it used to be. Not silent, but changed. The usual arguments are shorter. Fewer children are playing. A cart has passed twice already that day with a sound everyone recognises now. Inside, a woman is boiling water, or heating wine, or preparing some small treatment she has been told may help. A man lies with fever. His swelling is visible now. A child is told not to touch him, and then scolded for crying too loudly. An older woman mutters prayers while also giving practical instructions because the two are not separate in her mind. Someone must fetch a priest. Someone must not leave. Someone must find food. Someone must decide whether the bedding can be washed, burned, shaken out, or simply endured. And all the while the city presses against the walls, full of other rooms where the same decisions are being made. The greatness of Constantinople did not vanish, but it changed texture. Hagia Sophia still stood. The palace still existed. The walls still guarded the landward side. The imperial titles still sounded magnificent. But plague has a way of making grandeur feel strangely thin. A dome cannot lower a fever. A wall cannot keep out what has already passed into the bloodstream. A law cannot command a swelling to recede. That does not mean grandeur is meaningless. People may have looked at the great church and felt hope, awe, anger, or desperate need. Public monuments matter because they tell people the world is larger than their suffering. But when suffering becomes too immediate, the distance between imperial display and human vulnerability becomes painful. The city that claimed to be the centre of the Roman world was also a place where someone's mother could die unattended, because everyone nearby was too frightened or too sick to help. Modern historians continue to argue about the larger consequences of the Justinianic Plague, and that debate is valuable. Some recent work has challenged older claims of universal demographic collapse, while other scholars emphasise that contemporary testimony, archaeological evidence, and regional disruption still point to a serious and in some places devastating pandemic. But standing inside Constantinople in 542, the larger debate disappears. No one in that room is asking whether later historians will classify the pandemic as transformative or overstated. They're asking whether the fever has broken. They're asking whether the body will be taken away. They're asking whether the market is safe. They're asking why the neighbour's house has gone quiet. History at a distance loves scale. Life inside disaster is measured in cups of water, hours of breathing, footsteps outside the door, and the small movement of a sick person's hand. As days turned into weeks, the city would have developed new habits, because human beings do that even under terrible pressure. They learn where not to go. They learn which doors to avoid. They learn how to speak of death without saying too much in front of children. They learn to recognise the signs of a house in trouble. They learn to make smaller meals, shorter visits, quicker bargains, more careful prayers. They learn to look at a healthy face with gratitude and suspicion at the same time. They learn that news can wound before disease does. They learn that sleep is not always rest, because dreams fill with what the day refuses to organise, and then morning comes and the city demands action again. No one could truly hide because Constantinople was not built for hiding. It was built for gathering, ruling, trading, worshipping, feeding, taxing, employing, displaying, and surviving through connection. The plague entered those connections and turned them against the people who depended on them. A city too crowded to hide is not only a city with many bodies, it is a city where every person's life is tied to the movement of others. The baker needs the miller needs grain, the grain needs ships, the ships need sailors, the sailors need harbours, the harbours need labourers, the labourers need households, the households need markets, the markets need trust. And once trust becomes infected, even the healthy begin to live differently. By evening, Constantinople under the shadow would not have looked like the city of imperial ceremonies. It would have been a place of lowered voices and practical dread, lamps lit behind shutters, families listening, dogs moving through streets with less interruption, priests passing quickly, officials trying to make lists that could not keep up with bodies. Somewhere, a wealthy household shutting its gates. Somewhere else, a poor woman standing in line for bread because fear had not removed hunger. The water still moved in the harbours. The walls still stood. The churches still called people toward God. But inside the rooms of the city, behind doors that could not seal out the world, the plague had become domestic. It was no longer simply something that came on ships or moved through markets. It was in the bed near the lamp beside the child, under the hand placed carefully on a burning forehead. And that is where the next part of this story has to go, because once the sickness entered the household, history stopped being a matter of empire and became a question of how a family tried to last through one more night. Once the plague crossed the threshold of a house, the story stopped belonging to emperors. It no longer mattered, at least not in that first terrible moment, whether Justinian's armies were in Italy, whether the law courts were open, whether the grain ships were still arriving, or whether the city outside was calling this a punishment, a corruption of the air, or a sickness brought by sea. Inside the house, the question became smaller and harder. Who is warm? Who has eaten? Who is sleeping too deeply? Who has a swelling? Who touched the cup? Who will sit beside the bed? And who, if the worst happens, will still be strong enough to open the door in the morning? That is where family life during the first pandemic has to be understood, not as a neat historical category, not as a lane in a textbook that says the plague reached Constantinople in 542, but as a room where people who loved and depended on one another suddenly became dangerous to one another in ways they could not see. The Justinianic Plague was almost certainly caused by Yersinia pestis, and contemporary descriptions emphasise fever, delirium, and buboes, those painful swellings of the lymph nodes that gave bubonic plague its name. But a 6th century family did not have a bacterium in mind. They had a father on a mat, a child with burning skin, a servant who would not admit she felt ill, or a mother trying to keep everyone quiet while listening to the breathing of the person in the corner. Let us go into one of those houses carefully. Not a palace house with courtyards, attendants, mosaics, storerooms, and enough space to pretend that distance was protection. A more ordinary urban dwelling, the kind where the household might include parents, children, perhaps an older relative, perhaps a servant or apprentice, perhaps a lodger if money was tight. The exact arrangement varied enormously across the city, because Constantinople contained wealth and poverty pressed near one another in the way capitals often do. But many people lived with very little private space. The house was not a sealed unit, it was porous. Food came in from outside, water came in from outside, news came in from outside, work pulled people out, and obligation pulled them back. If one person became ill, the sickness was not isolated in a separate sick room arranged for comfort and cleanliness. It was present in the room where people cooked, slept, prayed, stored belongings, argued, waited, and tried not to look frightened in front of the children. Modern people sometimes speak about quarantine as if it were mainly a matter of willpower, but in a crowded 6th century household, separation could be almost impossible. You could move a mat a little farther from the others. You could tell children not to touch. You could wash what could be washed. You could burn incense or herbs if you believed it might help. But you could not make the house larger. A fever often begins with negotiation, not with others first, but with yourself. A person feels a chill, a heaviness, a pain behind the eyes, and the mind immediately begins bargaining. It is nothing. It is the weather. It is tiredness. It is bad food. It is fear making the body foolish. In a plague-struck city, that private bargaining would have had a terrible intensity. To speak the words "I am ill" was to change the room. Everyone would hear the meaning beneath the sentence. The mother might stop kneading bread. The older child might look up too quickly. The father might ask where the pain was. An older relative might begin crossing herself or whispering a prayer. If the swelling appeared in the groin, under the arm, near the ear, then denial became harder. Procopius described cases where fever was followed by these swellings, and he also described strange variations in how people suffered, with some falling into coma-like sleep and others into delirium or agitation. Try to imagine watching that without the comfort of modern explanation. The body is doing something. It is producing signs. The signs are real, visible, touchable, but the meaning is still trapped behind a wall. The first responsibility inside the household was care, and care was dangerous. Someone had to bring water, someone had to cool the skin, someone had to lift the sick person when bedding needed changing, someone had to wipe vomit, sweat, blood or discharge if those appeared, someone had to coax the sick to drink, someone had to answer if the person called out in confusion. Most likely much of this fell on women, not because men never cared for the sick, but because domestic care in late antique and early medieval households was deeply tied to the work expected of wives, mothers, female relatives, and servants. That expectation could become a trap. A woman might be the person most needed by everyone, which meant she had the least freedom to protect herself. She had to prepare food for the healthy, tend the sick, manage frightened children, keep track of household stores, receive or refuse visitors, decide when to call a priest, and perhaps hide her own fear, because the entire emotional balance of the room depended on her ability to keep moving. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being needed continuously by people who may not survive your help. Now, we should be precise about danger. Bubonic plague is usually associated with fleas moving from infected rodents to humans, not simple casual contact between people in every case. But plague can appear in different forms, including pneumonic plague, which can spread more directly through respiratory droplets, and in any real outbreak people did not know which danger they were facing or where it was coming from. A household might fear the sick body for reasons that were partly right and partly wrong. They might fear the breath, the bedding, the smell, the swelling, the clothing, the air of the room, the anger of God, the touch of a corpse, the presence of animals, or the invisible stain of death itself. In practical terms, the uncertainty hardly mattered. The sick person needed help, and helping brought the helper close to whatever danger had entered. Love reduced distance. Fear asked for distance. The household lived between the two. Children would have understood more than adults wanted them to. That is almost always true. A child in a plague house might not know what a bubo meant, but they knew when adults lowered their voices. They knew when a normal errand became frightening. They knew when a sleeping person was not to be disturbed, and when that instruction carried something heavier than ordinary discipline. They knew when food changed. They knew when someone cried in another room and then pretended not to have cried. In a crowded household, children could not be fully shielded from sickness or death. They might be sent to a neighbour if a neighbour would take them. They might be told to sit still, to pray, to stop touching things, to stop asking questions, to be brave, to be quiet. But the more adults commanded quiet, the louder the child's own thoughts could become. Where is my mother going? Why does my brother not answer? Why is the priest here? Why is the door open at night? Why does the house smell different? Food became another kind of worry. In normal life, a household's food rhythm depended on markets, storage, fuel and labour. During plague, each of those could be disturbed. If the person who normally shopped became ill, someone else had to go. If prices rose or supplies faltered, meals shrank. If fear kept people indoors too long, stored food disappeared quickly. If the mother of the house became sick, the practical knowledge of the household might be suddenly unavailable. Where things were kept, what could be stretched, what needed cooking first, who owed money, who could be trusted, which neighbour might help. That kind of knowledge rarely appears in chronicles, but it keeps people alive. A chronicler can tell us that plague struck Constantinople, that bodies multiplied, that fear spread. He does not usually tell us which child burned the porridge because his mother was too weak to stand, or which servant stole a handful of flour because everyone assumed the household would be dead by morning. Water was just as important. A feverish person needs fluids, and a house under plague needs cleaning, at least as far as its members understand cleaning. But water required movement. Someone had to fetch it from a cistern, fountain, well, or shared source depending on the household and neighbourhood. That meant entering public space. It meant touching vessels, waiting near others, listening to rumours, and returning with more than water. The person sent out might come back pale and shaken, not because they had seen anything new exactly, but because the city outside confirmed what the household had been trying to keep contained. More bodies, another closed shop, a familiar face missing, a price changed, a neighbour refusing to open, a cart moving too slowly. The errand for water became an errand into knowledge. The house itself would begin to feel different. Objects that had been ordinary became charged with fear. A cup used by the sick person, a blanket, a belt, a tunic, a stool near the bed, a bowl of unfinished food, a child's toy lying too close to the mat, a doorway curtain touched by too many hands. In plague conditions, people often develop an instinctive map of danger, even when the map is scientifically incomplete. Do not sit there. Do not use that bowl. Do not sleep near him. Do not breathe too closely. Do not let the little one crawl over that mat. These rules may have shifted by the hour, depending on fear, fatigue, and the advice most recently heard. A physician might recommend one thing, a neighbour another, a priest another, an older relative another. In the absence of certainty, households become crowded not only with people, but with instructions. The arrival of a physician, if one came, would have altered the room. Byzantine medicine inherited older Greek and Roman traditions, and physicians were trained to observe, interpret and treat according to the medical theories available to them. They were not fools, and we should not turn them into caricatures. They could recognise patterns. They could examine swellings. They could offer regimens, cautions, procedures and drugs. But when plague moved quickly, skill met its limit. Some treatments may have comforted, some may have harmed, some may have done very little. Procopius noted that physicians were unable to predict reliably who would die and who would recover, and that even similar cases could have different outcomes. Imagine being the family watching that uncertainty. The doctor has come, he has looked, he has touched, or perhaps avoided touching, he has said words. But the words do not give the household what it wants most, which is a promise. If the priest came, he brought another kind of authority. In a Christian household of 6th century Constantinople, sickness was not only physical, it was spiritual, moral, cosmic, and communal. The sick might need prayer, confession, anointing, or the presence of sacred words before death. The household might need reassurance that suffering had meaning. The family might ask whether this was punishment, whether repentance could help, whether a vow should be made, whether an icon should be brought, whether alms should be given, whether a saint might intercede. It is easy for modern listeners to separate medicine and religion into different rooms. The people we're following did not live that way. A mother might boil a remedy, call a physician, pray before an icon, and promise an offering all in the same day without feeling any contradiction. When a child's fever rises, people use every door they believe might open. The emotional structure of the house changed as illness progressed. At first, the sick person remained a person with an illness. Then, if the fever deepened, the illness began to take over the household's sense of time. Everyone waited for signs: a cooling forehead, a clearer voice, a swelling that softened. A night passed without worsening, or the opposite. A breath that rattled, a delirious phrase repeated again and again, a refusal of water, a stillness too deep. The healthy became watchers. Watching is exhausting because it looks passive from the outside, but inside the body it is constant work. The watcher hears every breath. The watcher wakes at every shift. The watcher measures hope in tiny changes. And because plague could move through a household, the watcher also watches themselves. A pain in the neck, a warmth in the face, a tremor in the hands. Am I frightened or am I ill? That question could destroy sleep. Sleep in such a house was not restful. Where would people sleep if one member was sick? Perhaps some moved to another room if the household had one. Perhaps children were arranged farther away. Perhaps an older relative refused to move because they believed their age made caution pointless, or because love made caution feel shameful. Perhaps a servant slept near the doorway ready to run for help. Lamps burned longer than usual if the family could afford oil. Darkness made fever more frightening. It always does. In daylight, the room at least has edges. At night, every sound becomes larger. A moan, a cough, a footstep outside, a whispered prayer, a rat in the wall, if there were rats. No longer just a nuisance, but a sound history has taught us to hear with dread. The family may not have understood the rodent connection clearly, but we do, and that makes the house feel unsafe in a second way, beneath the level of human fear. And yet, even in such rooms, ordinary tenderness remained. This is important because plague stories can become so full of horror that they accidentally erase love. Someone adjusted a blanket. Someone held a cup. Someone smoothed hair away from a sweating forehead. Someone lied kindly and said, "You look better." Someone told a child that the sick person was sleeping. Someone saved a portion of food in case the fever broke and hunger returned. Someone sat longer than was wise because leaving felt unbearable. People did not become symbols just because history later turned them into a pandemic. They remained themselves, stubborn, frightened, generous, selfish, brave, irritable, practical, loving, exhausted. A father might snap at a child and regret it immediately. A mother might pray with perfect sincerity and then become angry at everyone in the room. An older sibling might feel jealous of the attention given to the sick and then be ashamed of it. Disaster does not purify people. It reveals them under pressure. There was also the question of neighbours. In a dense city, neighbours were not optional. They heard things. They smelled things. They noticed who had gone quiet. They saw whether smoke rose from a cooking fire, whether a door opened, whether children appeared, whether someone came asking for water or linen. A household with plague needed help, but asking for help could mark the house as dangerous. A neighbour might bring food and leave it at the threshold. Another might refuse to come. Another might enter because duty, friendship, kinship, or faith overcame fear. Another might take advantage of the chaos. We should not imagine either perfect solidarity or universal abandonment. Cities under stress contain both. There were people who helped at real risk to themselves. There were people who withdrew because they were terrified. There were people who did both on different days. When death came, if it came, the house entered another crisis. A death in normal circumstances has a process. The body is prepared. family and community gather. Religious rites give shape to grief. The dead are carried to burial with recognised gestures. But during the plague in Constantinople, contemporary accounts describe burial systems overwhelmed by the number of dead, with bodies accumulating and emergency measures being taken. Procopius's numbers and details are debated, but his testimony clearly conveys a city in which ordinary burial practice could not keep pace with mortality. For a household, this meant that death did not immediately leave. The body might remain in the house longer than custom allowed. Someone had to decide what to do with it. Someone had to touch it. Someone had to wrap it. Someone had to go out and seek help from a world already overloaded with the same request. This is where the house with no safe corner becomes most painfully literal. The sick bed is dangerous. The street is dangerous. The neighbour's house is dangerous. The church may be crowded. The market may be necessary. The body of the dead is dangerous, or at least feared. The body of the living is uncertain. Even the self is no refuge because the disease can already be inside you before you know it. A family under those conditions could feel surrounded without any enemy at the door. There is no soldier to plead with, no official to bribe, no wall to strengthen. The danger has no face. So people gave it faces where they could. They blamed bad air, moral failure, divine anger, outsiders, ships, certain neighbourhoods, certain foods, certain sins. Blame is often the mind's attempt to build a wall after the body has learned there is none. If more than one person became ill, the household's order could collapse very quickly. The first patient receives care. The second creates fear. The third creates logistics no family is ready for. Who cares for whom when the caregivers fall? Who prepares food if the person who knows how to manage the stores is delirious? Who keeps the youngest child away from the bedding if the older children are sick too? Who earns wages if the adults cannot leave? A household is a system of roles, and plague attacks roles as much as people. The strong become weak. The dependent may be forced to act. A child may bring water to an adult. A servant may become the only functioning manager of a house. An elderly relative may outlive the young and find themselves responsible for decisions they thought had passed to the next generation. These reversals leave marks that do not appear in death counts. There must have been many houses where the plague did not kill everyone, and those houses had their own burden. Survival after a household outbreak is not simple relief. It is relief mixed with guilt, debt, memory, and work. The bedding must be dealt with. The room must be cleaned as people understand cleaning. Debts must be sorted. Orphans may need placement. Tools, clothing, and small possessions must be redistributed. If the dead were wage earners, the living face poverty. If the dead were mothers, the household loses its central manager of daily survival. If the dead were children, the house becomes quieter in a way no one wanted. The plague may pass out of the body, but it leaves behind rearranged lives. Evagrius Scholasticus, who survived plague as a child, later wrote of repeated losses in his family and household across later waves, showing how the first pandemic did not end as a single memory but returned again and again to reopen private grief. I want to pause on the mother of such a house, not because every household had the same structure, but because domestic labour so often gathered around women in ways history under records. She has been awake too long. Her hands smell of smoke, water, oil, sweat, perhaps vinegar or herbs. She has listened to advice from people who contradict one another. She has kept one child from climbing onto the sick bed. She has tried to make a small amount of food stretch. She has looked at her own skin in private, searching for signs. She has prayed, perhaps angrily, perhaps with discipline, perhaps with the numb repetition of someone too tired to produce emotion. She has wondered whether opening the door will bring help or danger. She has wondered whether closing it makes her cruel. There is no policy in that room. There is only judgment, and every judgment feels like it could be wrong. Men face their own pressures. A father might feel responsible for bringing food and money into the house, while also fearing that his work outside had brought disease back to it. If he became sick, he might feel shame as well as terror, because illness took away his usefulness. If his wife or child became sick, he might be expected to make decisions without knowing what was right. Should he spend money on a physician? Should he seek burial help now? Should he send the healthy children elsewhere? Should he flee with the living and leave the dying? These are unbearable questions, and plague forced ordinary people to ask them without preparation. We sometimes imagine moral courage as a clear choice between good and evil. In a plague house, choices could be between one danger and another. The children, if they survived, would remember fragments, not the whole chronology. Children rarely remember disaster as adults organise it. They remember the lamp burning at the wrong hour, the taste of watered wine or stale bread, their mother's voice sounding different, the smell near the bedding, the shape of a covered body, being told not to ask, being sent to stand outside, a neighbour leaving food and walking away quickly, a prayer repeated so often that it became both comfort and fear. Years later, they might not remember exactly when the plague reached the city or how long it lasted. They would remember that the house changed, that adults were afraid, that someone disappeared from the room and did not return. This is what the first pandemic did at the household level. It turned the home, the place that was supposed to protect the family from the world, into a place where the world's danger had already arrived. It made care frightening, distance painful, food uncertain, sleep thin, prayer urgent, and ordinary objects suspect. It forced families to improvise their own small rules under the pressure of a disease they could not understand. It exposed how dependent each person was on the others, and how fragile that dependence became when illness entered the body of the one who cooked, carried, earned, nursed, prayed, or decided. The empire could count taxes, issue laws and build churches, but inside the house the pandemic was counted differently. One cup of water, one fevered night, one missing voice at morning, one more person still breathing, and as more houses entered that same private crisis, the city outside had to face a public one. A plague can begin in households, but death does not remain indoors forever. Bodies had to be moved, rites had to be shortened or abandoned. Streets became part of mourning. Officials and neighbours had to decide what could still be done when the number of dead exceeded the number of hands willing or able to carry them. The doorway of the house opened again, not for trade or work or a child running into the street, but for the passage from private grief into the overwhelmed city, where the dead of many families began to gather in ways Constantinople could no longer hide. The doorway opened, and the private grief of the house entered the public grief of the city. That is the moment when a plague stops being something that happens inside families and becomes something that changes the sound of streets. A body had to be carried out, a neighbour had to look away or help, someone had to find cloth, or a board or a stretcher, or two men willing to lift what everyone feared to touch. In ordinary times, death in Constantinople had a path. The household mourned, the clergy were called, prayers were said, the body was prepared. The dead were taken from one condition of belonging to another, from the room of the living to the ground of the dead, with the community acknowledging that a person had passed out of sight but not out of memory. The plague attacked that path. It did not merely kill, it interrupted the actions that made death recognizable. It made bodies too numerous, labour too scarce, fear too reasonable, and time too short. Procopius, who was in Constantinople when the disease struck, wrote that the healthy stayed inside tending the sick or mourning the dead, and that if a person did appear in the street, he was often carrying one of the dead. He also described work stopping, trades being abandoned, and a city rich in supplies coming close to hunger, because normal life could no longer perform its ordinary tasks. Think about what a street is supposed to do. It is a channel for movement. It takes a baker to his oven, a child to an errand, a priest to a church, a porter to the harbour, a servant to the market, a woman to the water source, an official to his office. It is not meant to hold stillness for long. In a healthy city, even a poor and crowded one, a street has arguments, footsteps, animals, sellers, wheels, calls, laughter, insults, bargaining, and the small collisions that make urban life exhausting and alive. During the plague, the street became something else. It became a place of listening. Doors opened slightly, then closed. People looked from windows or thresholds instead of stepping fully outside. A cart passing did not mean trade. It might mean collection. Footsteps at the wrong hour could mean a priest, a messenger, a neighbour asking for help, or men carrying a body. Procopius says it became difficult to see anyone in the streets of Byzantium at all, and that the people who were still healthy remained in their houses, either attending the sick or mourning those who had died. The silence would not have been complete. That is too neat, too theatrical. A city under plague still makes noise. Babies cry, animals move, wood breaks, doors scrape, people cough. Someone shouts because grief has made restraint impossible. Someone argues over payment. Someone calls for water. A cartwheel catches against stone. A priest chants prayers in a voice that sounds steady because it has to. But the balance of sound changes. The ordinary public confidence of the city weakens. Markets thin. Workshops fall quiet. The harbour still matters, but the men who work it do so under a different kind of attention. The sounds that remain become isolated and easier to notice. A footstep becomes a question. A dog barking becomes ominous. The striking of wood or metal from a church, the sound that called people toward prayer in the Byzantine world, would have reached ears already trained by fear. We often imagine bells because bells are how later Christian cities announced time, worship, danger, and death to our minds. In the Byzantine East, wooden or metal sumantra, struck instruments used to summon the faithful, had a long history and were part of the religious soundscape, while bells became more prominent later in Byzantine practice. So when we speak of bells and silence here, we should hear not only bronze ringing in a tower, but also the hard wooden knock of a sementron, a sound moving through streets where people were no longer sure whether they were being called to prayer, mourning, warning, or endurance. Death in ordinary numbers can be absorbed by ritual. Death in extraordinary numbers becomes administration. That is a cold sentence, but the coldness is part of the horror. There comes a point in mass mortality when grief does not disappear, but it is forced to share space with the logistics. Where will the bodies go? Who will carry them? Who will pay? How deep can graves be dug? Which cemetery is full? How long can a body remain inside a house? What happens when the gravediggers are dead or gone? What happens when the men willing to carry bodies demand more money because the work has become frightening? John of Ephesus, whose account survives through later Syriac transmission and is one of the major eyewitness traditions for the plague, described burial becoming so desperate that payment for carrying the dead rose sharply, and people were scarcely found to remove bodies. His account also says that carriers themselves could collapse and die while carrying stretchers. Whether every number in these accounts can be treated as exact is another matter, and historians debate the scale, but the emotional truth is unmistakable. The city's normal machinery for honouring the dead could not keep pace with the dead themselves. At first, people tried. That may be the saddest part. They tried to preserve order. They tried to shroud the dead properly. They tried to count. They tried to carry bodies with some care. John of Ephesus describes the poor dying first in the streets and being taken away while enough healthy people still remain to remove and bury them. He also describes men standing by harbours, crossroads and gates counting the dead, as if counting could keep the catastrophe inside the boundaries of understanding. There is something deeply human about that. When the world becomes frightening, people count. They count bodies, days, coins, loaves, symptoms, hours since fever began, hours since a person last spoke. Counting is the mind's attempt to build a railing beside the abyss. If the number is known, perhaps the event is known. If the event is known, perhaps it can be endured. But the accounts tell us that counting eventually failed. The numbers became too large, the pace too fast, the categories too small. At a certain point, the dead were no longer counted with the same confidence. They were moved because they had to be moved. This is where the city became physically overwhelmed. Burial space was not infinite. Labour was not infinite. Courage was not infinite. Procopius describes bodies being placed in places not normally intended for burial, and the ordinary customs around burial breaking down under pressure. In one famous passage, he says that when existing burial places were filled, bodies were brought to towers in the fortifications of Sycea across the Golden Horn and thrown in until the towers were filled, creating a terrible smell that reached the city. We have to read such descriptions carefully. Procopius was a skilled writer, and ancient historians often used vivid scenes to make moral and emotional points. But even when we allow for literary shaping, the picture is of a capital improvising with the dead. That is not a small failure. Burial is one of the ways a society tells itself that it remains civilized. When burial collapses, people feel that more than bodies are being lost. Imagine the men assigned to this work. Some may have been paid labourers, some may have been compelled, some may have volunteered out of piety or necessity. Some may have begun with a sense of duty and later become numb. They lifted bodies from houses where families cried or where no family remained. They carried the poor from streets. They took the dead from doorways. They learned to recognise the weight of a body recently dead and the more difficult condition of one left too long. They negotiated thresholds, stairs, alleys and crowds that were no longer crowds but clusters of watchers. They may have wrapped cloth over their noses against the smell. They may have prayed under their breath. They may have joked in ugly ways because men who do terrible work sometimes use ugliness to keep from breaking. They may have charged high prices because fear has a market value. They may have gone home at night and searched their own bodies for swelling. The smell of the city would have changed. This is one of the details that history cannot soften without becoming dishonest. When bodies remain unburied, or are gathered too rapidly in inadequate places, smell becomes part of public life. John's account speaks of people fearing to go into the streets because of the stench of corpses and bodies being eaten by dogs. Procopius also emphasises the odour produced by desperate burial measures. Smell is different from sight. You can decide not to look at a body. You can lower your eyes, turn a corner, close a shutter. Smell enters without asking. It settles in cloth, hair, bread, bedding, memory. A city that smells of death cannot pretend that death is contained. It makes the air itself into a witness. For people who believed that bad air might be part of disease, that odour would have been more than disgusting. It would have seemed dangerous, meaningful, perhaps even accusatory. Dogs appear in several plague narratives because dogs occupy the edge between household and street. They belong to people and not to people. They clean refuse, follow carts, linger near markets, bark at strangers, and discover what humans try not to see. In ordinary conditions, their presence could be annoying or useful. In plague, a dog near a corpse becomes a sign that human order has retreated. John's image of bodies being eaten by dogs is not merely a gruesome detail. It is a statement that the city's relationship with its dead has been broken. The dead are supposed to be claimed. By family, by church, by community, by ground. When animals reach them first, the living feel disgrace as well as horror. Even if one has no strength left to act, the sight wounds the conscience. The poor suffered publicly first, at least in the accounts that describe the streets. This is not surprising. Poverty makes death more visible. The poor had less space, fewer servants, fewer options for retreat, less stored food, less ability to pay for burial, and more dependence on the public life of the city. John of Ephesus specifically says the plague first heavily struck the poor who lay in the streets, and that their bodies were initially removed with diligence before the scale of the disaster grew beyond ordinary capacity. A wealthy death could remain behind a door longer. A poor death might become part of the street almost immediately. This does not mean the rich were safe. John and Procopius both describe the disease-crossing social rank, and Procopius says even Justinian became ill with a swelling in the groin and recovered. But inequality shaped how death appeared. The poor were more likely to be seen. Their bodies taught the city what was coming. There must have been a phase when people still followed the dead. A small procession, a few relatives, a priest, a body covered as properly as could be managed. Perhaps fewer words than usual. Perhaps a quicker route. Perhaps the children kept back. The family trying to do what families had always done. Then, as death multiplied, processions shortened. The priest could not come to every house. The gravedigger could not answer every request. Relatives became sick themselves. Fear made attendance smaller. The walk with the dead, once a public sign of belonging, became hurried, practical, sometimes impossible. A person could die and be removed without the full gathering that would have marked their place in the community. That kind of loss is hard to measure. It is not just that the person dies. It is that the gestures saying this person mattered are cut down by necessity. There is another sound in this part of the story, quieter than carts and wooden calls to prayer. It is the sound of names being spoken. In a house, the dead have names. In a public crisis, they risk becoming numbers. The carriers may not know them. The official lists may not keep up. The burial place may not preserve them. Families would have tried to hold on through speech. He was my father. She was my daughter. His name is this. Her name is this. Do not take him yet. Wait. The priest has not come. Wait. Her brother is on the way. Wait. We have not wrapped her properly. But the city under pressure begins to answer with urgency instead of patience. There are more bodies. There is no room. There is no time. That is one of the cruelties of mass death. The dead remain unique to those who love them, while becoming numerous to those who must manage them. The authorities could not ignore the problem. An emperor may be remote from an individual death, but he cannot be remote from bodies accumulating in his capital. Procopius reports that Justinian appointed an official named Theodore to deal with the removal and burial of the dead when the situation became unmanageable. It is a detail worth pausing over, because it shows the transformation of mourning into state business. The dead had become a public hazard, an administrative crisis, a matter of labour, payment, transport, storage and disposal. Theodore, or any official placed in such a role, would have faced a task no honour could make clean. He needed men, he needed places, he needed authority, he needed speed. He needed to make decisions that would be remembered not by the families of the dead as efficient, but as painful. That is what emergency government often does. It acts where tenderness would move too slowly. For the ordinary person, the appointment of an official may not have brought much comfort. Comfort is not the same as organisation. A family wants the dead treated with care. A city in crisis wants the dead removed. Those goals overlap until the number of bodies becomes too high, and then they begin to pull against each other. If your own mother is being carried away, you do not want to hear that there are thousands more. You want her name known. You want her body handled gently. You want the right spoken. You want the world to pause because she has left it. Plague refuses the pause. It keeps producing the next death before the last one has been mourned. In the middle of this, religion did not vanish. It became more urgent. The streets of Constantinople were not secular streets interrupted by a religious event. They belonged to a world in which divine judgment, repentance, intercession, and sacred protection were part of how people understood disaster. The calls to prayer, the movement of clergy, the sight of processions if they occurred, the use of sacred spaces, and the desperate need for burial rites all made death a spiritual crisis as well as a physical one. But religion itself was strained by numbers. A priest can pray over one body, he can pray over 10. What happens when there are too many houses calling? What happens when clergy fall sick? What happens when the living begin to feel that no amount of prayer is slowing the carts? Faith may deepen in such a time, but it may also ache. A person can believe and still be afraid. A person can pray and still wonder why the street smells of death. The stillness of abandoned work added another layer. Procopius says that trades were abandoned and work of every kind ceased, and that hunger became severe even in a city normally abundant in goods. That matters because death in the streets was not separate from bread in the house. If artisans stopped working, goods disappeared. If porters were dead or hiding, supplies failed to move. If bakers lacked grain or labour, bread became uncertain. If buyers feared markets, sellers lost income. A city is a chain of ordinary tasks, and plague breaks links faster than officials can repair them. So a family grieving one death may also be running out of food. A man carrying a body may not know whether his children have eaten. A widow may leave a corpse in the house longer than she should because the price of removal has risen, and she has no money left. These are the details that make public death so cruel. It does not replace ordinary need. It arrives on top of it. The silence after a cart passed must have been heavy. Those inside houses would listen until the wheels faded. Then what? The room returns, but not really. The person who has been taken away is now absent in a way the house cannot yet understand. Their mat remains, their cup, their tools, their unfinished work, maybe their smell, maybe the mark of their body on bedding. The family may want to clean immediately, or may be too tired to move. There is danger in the objects, or the fear of danger. There is also attachment. Throwing away a garment might feel practical and unbearable. Keeping it might feel loving and unsafe. No chronicle records these small decisions, but they happened by the thousands. The public removal of the body only began another stage of private labour. And then there were the houses where no one came out. Every city under epidemic developed stories about closed doors. A neighbour has not been seen. No smoke from the cooking place. No child at the threshold. No answer when someone knocks. Do you enter? Do you call others? Do you wait? What if everyone inside is dead? What if someone inside is alive but too weak to reach the door? John of Ephesus describes people afraid to go out and even wearing tablets identifying themselves in case they died away from home. A detail that shows how deeply the fear of anonymous death had entered daily life. That image stays with you. A person leaving the house with their own identity written on them, not for pride, not for office, not for ceremony, but so their body might be recognised if they fell in the street. It is difficult to imagine a clearer sign that the city's basic trust had broken. Recognition mattered. To die unknown in a crowd is one kind of fear. To die known but unclaimed is another. The tablet on the arm says, "I belong somewhere. Tell them. Let them come. Do not let me disappear into the number." In a plague city, identity itself needed protection. Not because people had forgotten their families, but because death had become too fast for the usual networks of knowledge. A man might leave to bury someone else and never return. A woman might go to fetch help and collapse. A child might be sent to relatives and vanish into confusion. The city that once connected people through markets, churches, neighbourhoods, and work now threatened to lose them in its overwhelmed streets. Modern scholarship reminds us to be cautious with the highest ancient death tolls. Peter Sarris notes that Procopius and John of Ephesus provide broadly comparable high estimates for daily deaths, and that such figures may have been derived from official sources, while also observing that ancient authors were trying to convey the full horror of what they witnessed. Other scholars have challenged the most catastrophic interpretations of the Justinianic Plague's wider effects, arguing that the evidence does not support using it as a single explanation for the end of antiquity. This caution is important, but it should not make us numb. Even if a number is exaggerated, the experience it points toward can still be devastating. A family does not need the official mortality rate to be exact in order to be destroyed. A street does not need a statistically perfect count in order to become a place people fear to enter. The hardest part to hold in the mind is repetition. 1 body is shocking, 10 bodies are horrifying, hundreds change the structure of perception. After a while, the city must have developed habits around sites that should never become habitual. People learn to step around, to look quickly and then not look, to identify which carts carried what, to speak in lower voices near certain houses, to save grief for later because there was no room for it now. This is not because people became heartless. Numbness is sometimes the mind's emergency shelter. A person cannot feel the full weight of every death in a city. If they tried, they would become unable to carry water, bake bread, tend a child, or bury their own. So the mind narrows. This one is mine. That one is not. This house I know. That street I avoid. This prayer I can say. That sound I cannot bear. By night, the imperial city must have felt altered in a way daylight could not disguise. Lamps burned behind doors. Some houses were too quiet. Some were noisy with fever. The religious calls that usually organise time may have sounded strained against the number of dead. If a sementron was struck, the wood's hard notes would have moved through air already carrying smoke and fear. The churches still stood. Hagia Sophia still rose over the city. The palace still held the machinery of rule. The sea still moved against the harbours. But a city is not preserved by buildings alone. It is preserved by routines, and the routines of Constantinople were wounded. Too many bodies had crossed too many thresholds. Too many names were being spoken too quickly. Too many graves, pits, towers, or improvised burial places had received people who should have been mourned more slowly. The phrase, death in the streets, can become too easy because it is so dramatic. We need to make it difficult again. Death in the streets means a daughter seeing the covered shape of someone she knows on a stretcher. It means a man carrying a stranger because no one else will do it. It means a priest choosing which house to enter first. It means a paid carrier asking for money from a family that has almost none. It means the smell at a crossroads making a child gag. It means a door marked in memory because everyone inside died. It means a body removed before a proper farewell because heat and fear would not wait. It means people learning the geography of loss by where the cart stopped. And still, life did not end. That is almost unbearable too. Someone had to sweep. Someone had to feed animals. Someone had to light lamps. Someone had to make bread if flour could be found. Someone had to comfort a child who had heard too much. Someone had to go to the water source. Someone had to return to a workshop after burying a brother because hunger does not pause for grief. Constantinople under plague was not only a city of bodies, it was a city of survivors moving around bodies, through the memory of bodies, away from bodies, toward the duties left behind by bodies. Survival was not clean. It was not triumphant. It was repetitive, compromised, and tired. By the time the worst pressure on the streets began to ease, no one who had lived through it would have understood the city in quite the same way. The harbour was not only a harbour. The market was not only a market. A cart was not only a cart. A church call was not only a call to worship. The street had shown what it could become when the number of dead exceeded the city's capacity for tenderness. People had seen rank collapse in the body, wealth purchase only partial distance, ritual strain under numbers, and imperial order reduced to the practical work of moving corpses. That knowledge does not leave quickly. It settles into how people listen, how they pray, how they greet a ship, how they measure a fever, how they look at a neighbour's closed door. And while families were still counting their dead, and officials were still trying to restore movement to the capital, another question pressed against the city with the force of hunger and prayer together. What did this mean, and who had the authority to answer? When a city has carried too many bodies through its streets, someone eventually asks what it means. Not what caused it in the way we would ask now, not first of all, not with microscopes, bacteria, fleas, and rodent reservoirs arranged in a clean chain of explanation. The question that pressed hardest against Constantinople was older and more frightening. Why? Why the city? Why now? Why the child and not the old man? Why the poor first, then the wealthy too? Why the sinner and the pious person in the same week? Why did prayers seem to rise into the same air that carried the smell of death? Why did the emperor, the man whose body represented imperial order, fall ill and then rise again while so many unnamed people did not? This was the question no one could answer, not because no one tried, but because every answer broke somewhere under the weight of grief. Let us begin with Justinian himself, because in the 6th century Roman world the emperor was not just a political figure sitting at the top of an administrative chart. He was the centre of an entire vision of order. His laws reached into property, marriage, inheritance, crime, church life, and the machinery of government. His armies had crossed seas to reclaim North Africa from the Vandals and fight in Italy against the Ostrogoths. His building projects had remade parts of Constantinople after the Secca Revolt, especially Hagia Sophia, whose vast dome was completed only a few years before the plague entered the capital. Justinian was an emperor of enormous ambition, and his reign had the feeling of a man trying to gather the Roman world back into his hands by law, war, theology, and stone. Then the plague came into his capital, and showed him a category of power that did not care about imperial intention. Britannica.com, sourcebooks.web.fordham.edu. Procopius reports that Justinian himself became sick during the outbreak in Constantinople and developed one of the characteristic swellings, but survived. That detail must have moved through the city with tremendous force. Imagine hearing it in a house where someone you loved had just died. The emperor has the plague. Imagine hearing it while standing in a bread line, or while carrying water, or while watching men remove another body from the street. The emperor has the plague. For some, it may have sounded like proof that no rank was safe. For others, his recovery may have seemed like a sign that God still preserved the ruler. For his enemies, or for those already exhausted by taxation, war, and imperial pressure, it may have sounded like a bitter miracle. The man who commanded so much had been touched by the same disease and returned while their own households had been emptied. The same fact could create awe, resentment, hope, and confusion, depending on where you stood when you heard it. Sourcebooks.web.fordham.edu. We should not imagine Justinian lying in some ordinary room, sweating beside a cooking fire while frightened children whispered in the corner. Imperial illness had layers around it. Attendants, physicians, guarded access, palace rumour, court anxiety, political calculation. Yet even in the palace, the body remained a body. A swelling in the groin did not become less painful, because the man suffering it wore purple. Fever did not respect silk. The palace could control information better than a poor household could, but it could not control the meaning people made once word escaped. In a monarchy, the ruler's body is never only private. If the emperor weakens, factions begin to think. Officials worry, generals listen, courtiers measure risk. Theodora, Justinian's empress, still alive at the time of the plague, had already shown during the Nika revolt that she possessed formidable nerve and political intelligence, and one can only imagine the pressure inside the palace if the emperor's condition seemed uncertain. Britannica.com. A plague in the streets is one disaster. A plague in the palace is another. It asks whether government can continue when the sovereign body itself becomes vulnerable. Laws may still exist, but someone must issue orders. Taxes may still be owed, but someone must decide whether to collect them. Burial may be necessary, but someone must organise the labour. Procopius says Justinian appointed Theodore to handle the burial crisis when ordinary arrangements failed, a detail that shows the government trying to turn panic into administration. That sounds almost reassuring until you sit with what it meant. The state had to manage corpses. The imperial system, built to count taxes, command armies, and proclaim law, now had to count and move the dead because the city could not bury them quickly enough. sourcebooks.web.fordham.edu. There is something deeply revealing about an empire at such a moment. In times of confidence, an emperor's authority can seem almost sacred. Officials bow, petitions are presented, laws are copied, coins carry the imperial image, churches pray for the ruler, soldiers fight in his name. But plague strips power down to its practical limits. Can the emperor make food arrive? Can he make workers return? Can he stop people from dying? Can he stop the smell? Can he make a mother believe that the death of her child has a purpose? Justinian could command men. He could not command the fever. He could appoint officials. He could not appoint enough days for every family to mourn. He could build Hagia Sophia. He could not build a wall around the bloodstream. And yet people still looked upward, because in crisis people need centres. Some look toward the emperor, many look toward the church. In 6th century Constantinople, the church was not a quiet institution separate from public life. It shaped calendars, rituals, doctrine, imperial legitimacy, moral explanation, and the everyday language of hope and fear. The emperor himself was deeply involved in religious matters, not as a casual supporter of Christianity, but as a ruler who believed unity in doctrine mattered to the stability of the empire. The religious world of Justinian's reign was also divided by fierce disputes over Christology, especially between Chalcedonian and Miaphysite communities, and those arguments were not academic to the people who lived inside them. They could shape careers, exile, imprisonment, episcopal authority, and imperial policy. Britannica.com, roger-pierce.com. So when plague arrived, people did not ask only doctors what was happening. They asked bishops, priests, monks, holy men, relics, icons, prayers, scriptures, dreams, and conscience. John of Ephesus, a bishop and one of the key eyewitness voices for the plague, interpreted the catastrophe in strongly religious terms, seeing it as divine punishment for human sin. That does not mean he was careless with suffering. It means he understood suffering through the framework available to him, a world in which God's judgment, mercy, warning, and correction were part of history itself. origins.osu.edu, roger-pierce.com. That kind of explanation can sound severe to modern ears, especially when we imagine saying it to someone who's just lost a child. But before we dismiss it too quickly, we should understand what it did for the people who believed it. To say the plague was punishment was terrifying, yes, but it also meant that disaster was not meaningless. It placed suffering inside a moral universe. It suggested that repentance mattered, that prayer mattered, that human action still had some relation to what happened next. Randomness is almost unbearable to human beings. A punishment can be feared, resisted, confessed, argued with, and begged against. A meaningless catastrophe gives you nothing to hold. So the language of divine wrath, harsh as it was, may also have given people a way to remain inside a world that still had order. Inside the churches, the question of meaning would have become immediate. A priest standing before frightened people could not give them germ theory. He could give them psalms, confession, exhortation, blessing, and the promise that death was not the final word. That mattered. It mattered to the sick. It mattered to the dying. It mattered to the living who had to return to houses where beds were empty. We should not reduce religious response to superstition, just as we should not romanticize it into perfect comfort. It was both explanation and burden. If the plague was punishment, then people could ask what sin had provoked it. Their own, the cities, the emperors, the empires, the wrong doctrine, the moral corruption of the wealthy, the hidden sins of the poor. Once a disaster is moralized, it becomes very easy for fear to search for blame, and blame travels quickly in crowded places. Some may have blamed foreigners, some ships, some bad air, some divine anger, some imperial policies, some theological opponents, some the luxurious habits of Constantinople, some the sins of humanity in general, which is a way of blaming everyone and no one at once. A man who had lost his family might listen to a sermon about repentance and feel pierced by it. Another might feel anger rising in him because he had already repented and the plague had still taken his wife. A woman might promise alms if her child recovered. Another might wonder what offering could matter when 3 children in the next house had died. Religious meaning did not remove confusion. It gave confusion sacred vocabulary. The church also had practical responsibilities. Clergy were called to the sick and dying. Burial rites had to be performed, shortened, repeated, or sometimes impossible to provide at the scale people expected. Sacred buildings became places where fear gathered. People came to pray for deliverance, to seek intercession, to confess, to ask whether the end of the world was near, or simply to stand where others were also afraid. The irony is hard and familiar. In a plague, gathering for comfort can also increase danger. The people of Constantinople did not know the disease as we do, but they were not blind to contagion in a general sense. They could see illness moving. They could fear proximity. Still, isolation has spiritual costs in a society built around ritual community. To stay away from the sick could feel like prudence or cowardice. To go to church could feel like faith or risk. To visit a dying neighbour could feel like mercy or a step toward your own grave. The emperor and the church were not separate authorities in the way a modern state and a modern religious institution might be imagined as separate. Justinian saw himself as responsible for Christian order, and his laws and policies reflect deep involvement in church affairs. He called councils, issued religious edicts, supported orthodox positions as he understood them, and tried to manage the fractures of Christian doctrine within the empire. That means the plague struck a world where political and religious meaning overlapped constantly. If the city suffered, people could look at the emperor's policies and at the city's sins in the same breath. If the emperor recovered, some could see divine favour. If the plague continued, others could ask whether the empire had failed spiritually despite all its churches and laws. Britannica.com. There is a scene worth imagining, not because a chronicle gives it to us exactly, but because it gathers the pressures of the moment. Justinian has recovered, or is said to be recovering. Somewhere in the city a family has not. A man stands in a church listening to prayers for the emperor and for deliverance from death. He has buried a son, or perhaps has not been able to bury him properly. The imperial name is spoken aloud with honour. The man hears it and feels 2 things at once. He wants the emperor to live because the empire collapsing would make everything worse. He also cannot help thinking that the emperor lived while his own child did not. He knows this is not a clean thought. He may even be ashamed of it. But grief is not always orderly enough to respect politics. On the other side of that same city, an official tries to restore normal records. Death has created inheritance problems, empty properties, unpaid taxes, missing labourers, disputed claims. Justinian's government did issue legislation dealing with inheritance and legal complications after the plague, because mass mortality does not stop at the grave. It spills into courts, property, debts, marriages, guardianship, and tax obligations. Wikipedia.org. This is one of the least dramatic and most important consequences of a pandemic. The dead leave paperwork. They leave fields, rooms, tools, animals, promises, dowries, debts, and children. An emperor who survives plague must govern not only the living, but the legal confusion produced by the dead. Procopius, depending on which work of his you read, gives us different Justinian. In the wars, he offers the formal historian's account. In the secret history, he gives us a darker, hostile portrait of the emperor and empress, full of bitterness, accusation, and even monstrous language. Historians debate how to use that work because it is valuable and vicious at the same time, but its existence reminds us that Justinian's authority was not experienced by everyone as simple glory. He was admired, feared, resented, obeyed, and criticized. The plague did not arrive in a politically neutral world. It arrived in a reign already marked by heavy taxation, war, religious division, building, and administrative pressure. Britannica.com. That matters because catastrophe rarely creates a society's tensions from nothing. It reveals them. If people were already exhausted by taxes, plague made tax collection feel crueler. If religious divisions were already bitter, plague made divine interpretation more urgent. If the poor already lived close to hunger, plague pushed them nearer. If the emperor already demanded much, the death of workers made those demands feel heavier. Procopius, in The Secret History, accuses Justinian of continuing to demand taxes despite devastation, though the tone and purpose of that work require caution. Still, even the accusation tells us something about how an imperial government could be perceived when it tried to maintain revenue after a disaster. Wikipedia.org. The church faced a different version of the same problem. It had to speak, but speech was dangerous. Say too little, and people feel abandoned. Say too much, and you risk giving an answer that grief cannot bear. Tell people the plague is punishment, and you may call them to repentance, but you may also wound the innocent. Tell them God is merciful, and they may ask why mercy has not saved the house next door. Tell them death is not the end, and they may believe you while still wanting one more day with the person who is gone. Clergy were not standing outside suffering, commenting on it from safety. Many were inside it. They saw bodies. They heard confessions. They entered infected houses. They buried or failed to bury. They likely became sick too. A theology of plague was not written only in calm rooms. It was spoken beside beds, in streets, in churches that smelled of wax, sweat, incense, and fear. The unanswered question changed depending on who asked it. For the emperor it may have been, how can order be restored? For an official, how many are dead and what must be done next? For a bishop, what is God saying? For a physician, why does this one recover while that one dies? For a mother, why my child? For a survivor, why not me? These are not the same question, though they all begin with why. The empire wanted a governable answer. The church wanted a salvific answer. The household wanted an answer that could be spoken over a body without sounding empty. No one possessed all three, and still they acted. That is what people do when answers fail. Justinian continued to rule. The church continued to pray, interpret and minister. Families continued to feed the living, prepare the dead, and endure what could not be explained. Officials continued making lists. Porters returned to work when hunger pushed harder than fear. Priests kept entering rooms. Physicians kept looking at swellings. Not because they had solved the question, but because life demands action even when meaning remains unfinished. There is something almost unbearable about that. Human beings often have to continue before they understand. When we look back, we can offer explanations they could not. We can talk about Yersinia pestis, transmission, ecology, climate, trade networks, grain routes, rodents, fleas, and recurrent waves. We can also talk about historiographical debate, because scholars today disagree over how catastrophic the first pandemic was across the whole Mediterranean, and whether older narratives exaggerated its role in ending antiquity. Some recent scholarship has challenged the idea that the Justinianic Plague caused uniform collapse, while other historians stress that contemporary accounts, ancient DNA, and regional evidence still point to a serious pandemic whose effects varied by place and time. pernas.org, academic.oop.com. That debate is important. But it does not answer the question as the people of Constantinople felt it. Science can explain how a disease moves. It cannot tell a grieving father why his daughter died and the emperor lived. History can describe structures. It cannot make every loss feel proportionate. That may be the central truth of this part of the story. The emperor and the church both offered forms of order. The emperor offered law, administration, appointment, taxation, continuity, and the claim that the Roman state still stood. The church offered repentance, prayer, sacred explanation, ritual, and the claim that death did not have the final word. Both mattered. Both were necessary to many people. Both also had limits. Neither could make the plague unhappen. Neither could return the dead to the rooms from which they had been carried. Neither could fully answer the question that rose from the city like smoke. As the worst days passed, if they passed in a given neighbourhood, people would have emerged into a changed relationship with authority. Some may have felt grateful that the emperor survived and that the city had not completely fallen apart. Some may have felt that God had spared them for reasons they needed to discover. Some may have become more devout, more generous, more fearful, more suspicious, more angry, or simply more tired. The official world would try to resume its rhythms. The churches would continue their liturgies. The harbour would receive ships again. The courts would hear cases. The tax collectors would come. But anyone who had lived through the plague knew something that ceremony could not erase. The greatest city in the empire had been made helpless in its streets. The ruler had been sick. The churches had been full of prayer, and the dead had still multiplied. The question had been asked by thousands of mouths, and no answer had been large enough to satisfy them all. So the empire went on, but not untouched. A body can survive fever and still remember the fever in its weakness. A city can survive plague and still carry it in habits, laws, sermons, prices, silences, and the way people listen when rumours come from the harbour. Justinian's world did not end in a single dramatic collapse when the plague arrived. That would be too simple. Instead, the disease entered a world already strained by ambition, war, tax demands, climate shocks, religious division, and the immense difficulty of holding a vast empire together. It added grief to pressure, uncertainty to policy, and theological urgency to ordinary fear. It did not answer the question of why. It made the question unavoidable. And once the fever receded from Constantinople, the deeper accounting began. Not only who had died, but what kind of world remained for those who had to keep living after the empire learned that even Rome could be made fragile. After the fever, the city did not wake into a clean morning. That is one of the mistakes we make when we think about epidemics from a distance. We imagine a terrible peak, then a decline, then relief, as if human life follows the shape of a neat line on a chart. For the people of Constantinople, and for the many towns, villages, ports, farms, monasteries, and military camps touched by the first plague pandemic, recovery was not a door opening all at once. It was more like standing in a damaged room after a storm and slowly realizing how many things are missing. The dead were gone, but their work remained. Their debts remained. Their children remained. Their tools remained. Their fields, shops, stools, tunics, half-finished repairs, marriage promises, legal claims, and places at the table remained. A household did not stop needing bread because the person who bought it had died. A field did not plough itself because the man who worked it was buried. A child did not become less hungry because his mother was no longer there to know where the flour was kept. When the first wave passed through Constantinople in 542, it did not end the story. The pandemic returned in waves across different regions for roughly 2 centuries, from its first appearance in the sources in 541 until around the middle of the 8th century, though historians still debate the full scale and consequences of those outbreaks. That means people did not live through plague as a single nightmare they could later place safely behind them. They lived with the knowledge that it could come back. Think about what that does to ordinary time. Before the plague, a ship coming into harbour meant grain, money, work, news, letters and movement. After the plague, a ship still meant those things, but it could also mean memory. People who had survived the first outbreak might look at sails differently. A rumour from Egypt, Syria, Palestine, North Africa, Italy or some inland town was no longer only a rumour. It had a possible shape: fever, swelling, silence in a house, a cart in the street, a church crowded with frightened people, a neighbour who was well on Monday and gone before the next market day. The plague had taught the Mediterranean world that distance was smaller than it looked. It had shown that the roots feeding cities and armies could also carry sickness. It had made connection feel less innocent. The first thing the plague took was people, and we should not hurry past that. It took named people before it took populations. It took husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, infants, apprentices, dock workers, clerks, soldiers, priests, beggars, servants, merchants, physicians and children, too young to understand why adults were suddenly whispering. Ancient writers give us terrible numbers, and modern historians argue about how far those numbers can be trusted. Procopius and John of Ephesus describe a disaster of immense scale in Constantinople and beyond, but recent scholarship has warned against treating every large ancient figure as precise, or using the pandemic as a single explanation for the transformation of the late antique world. That caution matters. It keeps us honest. But caution should not make the dead disappear again. Even if the highest estimates are too high, the lived event was still large enough to overwhelm burial, disrupt work, and enter memory. A mother didn't need a demographic model to know that her house had changed. A city did not need perfect statistics to know when the street smelled wrong. The second thing it took was labour. This sounds less emotional until you imagine it properly. Labour is not just work in the abstract. It is the hand that knows how to repair a hinge, the woman who knows which neighbour can be trusted with a child, the porter strong enough to move grain, the baker who understands his oven, the mule driver who knows the road, the scribe who can keep accounts, the farmer who knows when a field is ready, the midwife who has seen enough births not to panic. A society is made of this kind of practical knowledge, and much of it lives in bodies rather than books. When plague kills enough people in a place, it does not only reduce a number, it removes skill, memory, habits, and relationships. The surviving world becomes less competent for a while, not because the survivors are foolish, but because too many of the people who knew how things were done are no longer there to do them. In the countryside, the loss would have been measured in fields. Land is only wealth if someone can work it. A farm without hands becomes a worry. Seed must be saved, animals tended, vines pruned, ditches cleared, taxes paid, tools repaired, harvest gathered. If a household lost its strongest workers, everything became harder immediately. If a village lost too many people, neighbours might not be able to help because they had their own dead, their own sick, their own missing labour. The empire's tax system did not become gentle simply because grief had entered a settlement. Land still had obligations attached to it. Officials still expected revenue. Armies still needed pay. Cities still needed food. There is evidence that the plague created legal and fiscal complications for Justinian's government, including inheritance problems and pressure around tax collection after deaths in affected communities, though the wider economic effects varied by region and remain debated. For ordinary people, this meant the plague could continue to harm them long after the fever left. The dead no longer ate, but they also no longer worked. In the cities, labour loss appeared in different forms. A workshop might reopen with fewer hands. A market stall might be run by a widow who had never before negotiated alone in public. A child might be pulled into work earlier than expected because an adult wage had vanished. A household servant might become suddenly more valuable, or suddenly more vulnerable depending on who had survived. A landlord might find tenants gone. A creditor might discover that the debtor and his heirs were dead, or that the heirs were children with nothing. A court might have to decide who owned property when several relatives died close together. We often speak of aftermath as if it is quieter than the disaster itself, and in some ways it is. There are fewer cries in the street, fewer bodies to move, fewer doors opening to the same terrible news, but aftermath has its own noise. The knock of officials, the argument over inheritance, the child asking what happens now, the scraping of a stool that no one wants to sit in because it belonged to the person who is gone. The plague also took confidence from Justinian's project. Not all of it, and not in a simple way. The Eastern Roman Empire did not collapse in 542. Justinian continued to rule until 565. His laws continued to matter. His buildings stood. His armies remained active. The empire survived the first outbreak and many later shocks. Still, the timing was cruel. Justinian's reign had already been stretched by large ambitions, legal reform, costly building, religious management, wars in North Africa and Italy, conflict with the Sasanian Empire, and the heavy administrative demands of ruling a vast state. The plague arrived not in an idle empire, but in one already spending money, men, authority, and attention at a high rate. Modern scholars disagree about how much the pandemic damaged imperial power overall, but it is reasonable to say that it added severe pressure to a world already under strain. It did not need to destroy everything to change the balance of what was possible. Italy is one of the places where the larger story becomes especially bleak. Justinian's forces had fought to reclaim it from the Ostrogoths, and the Gothic War brought long destruction to the peninsula. Plague entered a world where war had already damaged cities, supply systems, and rural life. To say whether plague or war mattered more is probably the wrong question for the people who suffered both. If your town has seen soldiers, requisition, hunger, and then disease, the causes do not line up politely. They pile on. A widow does not separate grief into categories marked military, fiscal, environmental, and epidemic. She knows that the roof leaks, the field is neglected, the market is uncertain, and too many people who used to help are gone. History later sorts. Life at the time endured. The plague took something from religion too, though not faith itself. In many places, faith survived, deepened, hardened, or changed. People continued to pray, build, confess, process, argue doctrine, seek saints, and bury their dead with whatever rites could be preserved. But the plague placed a question inside belief that could not be fully removed. If God ruled history, what did this suffering mean? If repentance mattered, why did the innocent die? If the emperor was chosen to guard Christian order, why had his capital become a place of mass burial? Some answered with divine punishment, some with calls for repentance, some with endurance, some with silence. John of Ephesus and other Christian writers saw the catastrophe through a strongly religious lens, and that framework helped many people make sense of what they could not otherwise explain. But meaning is not the same as comfort. A person may believe suffering has a place in God's order, and still wake in the night reaching for someone who is not there. The repeated waves made memory unstable. A single disaster can become a before and after line. Recurrent plague does something else. It turns the future into a place where the past may return. A child who survived one outbreak could become an adult during another. A family that rebuilt after losing 2 members might later lose 3 more. A monastery that recorded one wave could hear of another in a different region years later. The first pandemic was not a steady universal blanket over the Mediterranean world. It appeared in waves, in places and times unevenly, sometimes severe, sometimes less visible in the record. But the possibility of recurrence changed how people understood safety. Recovery became provisional. The fever had gone for now. The ships had resumed for now. The market was noisy again for now. That phrase, even if no one said it aloud, must have lived beneath many ordinary days. There is another thing the plague took, and it is harder to name. It took the feeling that the human world was arranged in stable ranks. Of course, rank did not disappear. The wealthy still had better houses, more food, more servants, more options for retreat, and greater ability to absorb loss. The poor were still more exposed. Inequality remained. But the plague had shown that the body beneath rank was vulnerable. Justinian could fall ill. Bishops could fall ill. A rich household could close its doors and still find fever inside. A poor man and an imperial official could develop the same swelling. That kind of equality is not justice. It does not make society fair. It is a darker equality, the equality of flesh. People who survived would have remembered that purple, silk, title, learning and money could reduce some risks but not abolish mortality. This knowledge did not create a revolution. It did not suddenly make the empire democratic or gentle, but it unsettled the imagination. It reminded people that every social order is built on bodies that can fail. The plague also took names from history. This may be the hardest loss for us to repair. We know Justinian, we know Theodora, we know Procopius, we know John of Ephesus, we know Evagrius Scholasticus, we know some officials, bishops, generals and chroniclers because writing preserved them. But the vast majority of the people who lived and died through the first pandemic are gone without names, not just dead, unrecoverable. We do not know the dock worker who may have carried grain from an infected ship. We do not know the woman who cared for 4 people in one room and survived none of them. We do not know the child who wore an identifying tablet because the city had become too overwhelmed to guarantee recognition. We do not know the gravedigger who kept working until he could not. We do not know the families who left Constantinople and were blamed for carrying fear with them. The plague took their lives, and time took their names, and yet the world continued. This is not a comforting statement at first. Sometimes continuation itself feels cruel. The sun rises after burial. Bread must be made after a funeral. Taxes come after grief. Someone laughs too soon because the body cannot remain solemn forever. A market reopens. A child is born in a house where another child died. A widower remarries. A field is planted by hands that still remember who planted it last year. People keep moving not because they have forgotten, but because life leaves them no alternative. This is how civilization survived disasters without ever fully overcoming them. They absorb the dead into habits, laws, stories, silences, and changed expectations. If you walk through Constantinople months after the worst days, you might have seen life returning and mistaken that for healing. The harbour working again. Bakers shouting, children in alleys, priests entering churches, officials carrying documents, women bargaining with sharp voices because prices still mattered, men repairing stalls, unloading goods, guiding animals. The city would still look like a city. That is the strange strength of urban life. It can resume its surface faster than the people inside it recover. But look more closely. There is a household with no older son. A shop run by a brother because the owner died. A woman dressed in mourning standing longer than necessary near a church. A child too thin after weeks of disrupted food. A legal dispute over property because death came too quickly for instructions. A family that flinches when someone coughs. A priest who pauses before entering a sick room because memory has made him human. The empire after the fever was not empty. It was burdened. It had to continue wars, diplomacy, taxation and administration, with fewer people in some places and more fear in many. It had to preserve authority after authority had been shown to have limits. It had to speak of divine order after thousands had asked why and received no answer large enough for grief. It had to maintain trade after trade had become suspect. It had to feed cities through networks that could not be abandoned without causing hunger. It had to keep using the same roads, harbours and ships that had made the plague so effective. This is one of the deep lessons of the first pandemic. People cannot simply stop depending on the systems that endanger them. Constantinople still needed grain. Armies still needed roads. Merchants still needed ports. Families still needed markets. The world that had carried sickness was also the only world available for survival. Modern science has given us a clearer view of the organism than any 6th century physician or priest could have had. Ancient DNA studies have confirmed Yersinia pestis in human remains associated with the Justinianic pandemic. and researchers continue to study how plague strains emerged, spread, and disappeared across history. Modern history has also become more careful. Scholars now warn against treating the Justinianic Plague as a simple switch that ended antiquity by itself, while others stress that the pandemic's impact must be studied alongside climate events, war, trade, archaeology, texts, and regional variation. That carefulness is good. It keeps us from turning the past into a bedtime myth of one cause and one result. But the human truth remains plain enough. The plague took lives. It took certainty. It took labour. It took ritual order. It took confidence from systems that had seemed grand and durable. It took from the poor first and often hardest, but it did not leave the powerful untouched. It took people from houses and left the survivors to figure out how to keep living among their things. What did it leave? It left laws adjusted to death. It left sermons and chronicles searching for meaning. It left communities with missing workers and altered families. It left memories of streets where bodies had passed too often. It left suspicion attached to ships, rumours and fevers. It left a recurring fear that could wake whenever sickness appeared again. It left an empire still standing, but standing in a world that had learned fragility more deeply. And it left us many centuries later trying to listen through the official voices for the quieter ones underneath. Maybe that is the part worth carrying with you tonight. The Justinianic Plague is often described in the language of empires, pandemics, mortality, trade routes, and historical transformation. Those words are useful. They help us think. But they also stand at a distance. The real event happened in bodies and rooms. It happened when a person reached for water and could not lift the cup. It happened when a child noticed adults speaking differently. It happened when a ship came in, and no one yet knew what had come with it. It happened when a priest stepped through a doorway, when a porter lifted a body, when an official tried to make a list, when a widow counted food, when a survivor listened to harbour noise and felt something tighten inside. After the fever, the world did not become new. It became the same world with absences. That is usually how history changes most people's lives, not with a clean break, not with a dramatic announcement, but with the same table and one fewer person at it, the same street and a different silence in it, the same church and a prayer that now catches in the throat, the same harbour and a ship that looks ordinary until memory touches it. Justinian's world went on because worlds do go on. Empires continue until they do not. Cities reopen. Markets return. Children grow. Fields are planted. Laws are copied. Stones remain where bodies do not. But somewhere inside that continuation was the knowledge that the strongest walls in the world could not keep out everything, that the grandest emperor could still burn with fever, and that ordinary people, whose names were never carved into marble, had carried the heaviest part of the story.